Good evening all and welcome. For this chilly season I have partnered with Toasty Fox in making some special edition and exclusive Mortis Media heated hoodies. You just plug in a power source, select your heat setting and you're good to go. With a soft fleece interior and a wool exterior, the double lining will keep you nice and toasty through any weather. I actually got the first ever one of these and it has been a godsend in these frigid temperatures. The first 15 people will also get free shipping to anywhere in the world, so check it out in the description. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I used to work at a summer camp. Usually the kids would go to bed by 9 PM at the least, so the rest of us would just hang out around the fire. One night one of the kids came to the fire pit, which was about 100 yards from the cabin, saying that she was having trouble sleeping because of the noise. So I walk back with her and make sure everything is good in the cabin and come back to tell everyone to keep it down. Maybe 10 minutes later she comes back and says that she still can't fall asleep. I walk back with her again, and in my head I'm thinking that she's just being restless because we aren't being loud. But anyway, I make sure she's under the covers and head back to the fire pit. Just as I'm about to get there, I realize that I left my walkie-talkie in her room. So I head back there and see that she's sitting upright in bed with the walkie-talkie in her hand. I'm thinking, okay, whatever, and tell her to go to sleep. I head back to the fire pit and the guys are like, why did you say that to her? And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, we heard you on the walkie-talkie tell her that she would look better if she shaved her head. That all the girls look better with shaved heads. I never said that, but no one believed me. And it was obvious not her saying it either, since it was a grown man's voice. I rushed back to check on the cabin, and everything was normal. This story happened at my old house in Toronto. 3 of us lived on the main floor of a house, and a stranger lived in the basement. We didn't know much about the guy in the basement, besides he was a big gamer and smoked an awful lot of weed. Almost every night we could hear him coughing up a storm, as if he were about to die. I could hear this quite often. I began to realize that this wasn't really directly below my room. He appeared to be coughing in a room under our garage. Sure enough, my roommate and I went into the garage and jumped up and down, and could hear the hollow room below us. Eventually this guy decided to move out, and we were able to move our friend into the basement. It would be our first time down there, and I was excited to see this weird room under the garage. Our friend took us to the laundry room, which was under my room, where we discovered a creepy little red door that led to a cement-filled room with trash and old furniture. It was basically a dungeon. Was this where he smoked weed every day? It was full of mold and seemed dangerous to breathe in the air. Not the exciting room we'd hoped for. Our friend didn't understand our need to see the room because he was pissed off at the state of the apartment. I was surprised, since it appeared the other guy moved out and our friend moved right in the day after. Not too much to clean. But then my friend told me the guy had been gone for 2 weeks already and no one cleaned it. I thought about this for a moment, and immediately got a cold chill down my neck. The last 2 weeks this guy was gone, I could still hear the horrible coughing coming from that creepy room. This takes place at my childhood home, which sat on the edge of the woods. To separate the woods from the yard, my dad placed large boulders along the tree line. There was also a large mound of dirt from the foundation of the home in the woods. My youngest brother walks with a limp, and was rather short and pudgy at the time. These details are important for later. I was about 12 when it started. My 2 brothers, Jerry and Joe, their friend Nate, and I were playing hide and seek around the house. The entire property was fair game, woods included, and my youngest brother Joe was it, and me and the other 2 boys hid behind the dirt mound. We waited there for about 15 minutes and started getting worried because he never came looking for us. I remember volunteering to find him and ran all around the property but never did find him. I went inside and he was playing a board game with some other friends. Okay, no big deal. I asked an adult how long he had been inside, and they said about half hour. I ran back outside to tell the others. When I got to the hiding spot, they were laughing. They asked how I got away from Joe. I told them that he had been inside the entire time. They stopped laughing and looked at each other. I asked what was going on. Turns out they saw what they thought was Joe running behind me in the woods. As I reached the rocks, he disappeared. We saw him around a lot, but kind of ignored it, chalked it up to kids' imaginations, and played in the woods in groups. A few years later, we had another friend come over who'd never been to my house. We were all playing inside when he came into the room and asked why Joe was playing in the woods alone. We explained that Joe was at a friend's house and there was no way it was him. He insisted it was, and we asked him who told him about the man, and he had no idea what we were talking about. It still creeps me out. I used to work for my dad, who was partially self-employed doing regular maintenance and floor refinishing for a childcare program called Head Start. The one center was in an old school which was built not long after the turn of the century and served as a church functions building in addition to housing Head Start and another childcare. We always did floors over the summer. Anyone who's stripped and waxed floors knows that when you're putting the coating back on, it's quiet and relaxing. We were the only people in the building since it was midsummer weekend, and yet it felt off even before you entered, like something was watching you from the second floor windows. So here we are slowly progressing across this huge room, when we hear a thunk upstairs and then stop. Then it sounded like someone was skipping across the room and back, and then it stopped again. So we finished the layer and went upstairs. Mind you, the upstairs was a few classrooms with shelves, blocking direct movement from one end to the other, filled with supplies from the other classes. No one was up there, so we closed the doors and went downstairs to start the other room. Once again, this sound started, but this time I sprinted upstairs. The sound stopped before I reached the hall, but all the doors were open at various angles. We didn't hear the sound anymore that summer, but my dad asked the childcare advisor from the other end of the building if they heard any weird noises. She said no, but that one day they were sitting down for snacks and a few kids were staring in a corner. The aide asked them what they were looking at, and one of the kids asked, "Why can't the girl eat with us?" The aide looked around and asked, "What girl?" And the kid pointed to the corner and said, "The little girl with the white dress." I literally haven't set foot in the building since, and I have no desire to do so. I used to think ghosts were for scary stories, but I have trouble believing this isn't real. I don't believe in ghosts or the paranormal, but this one really baffles me to this day. It happened a few years back, and I still can't forget it. Most of my friends have had trouble with substance abuse throughout their lives. Just the crowd I hung around with, I guess. Around the time of this story, one of my closest friends was clean off heroin for the longest time they'd ever been. A few months, but still fantastic progress for him, and things were looking great. We were hanging out one day, and he gave me some great news. Since middle school, he and his mum had been fighting for a medical malpractice lawsuit that happened to him when he was younger, and they won. He got something like 10 to 15K out of the deal, so most of what we talked about that day was how he was going to buy something nutly go to college. I honestly hadn't seen him that happy in years, and it was great. A day or two later, I was sleeping like normal, when all of a sudden I woke up at 1 a.m. in the morning. I felt great. In fact, I felt absolutely euphoric, like I was laying in the sun on the most beautiful summer's day in a puddle of 1,000 puppies. And that was just the first second. The next second, it amplified. Within moments, however, I went from "this is pretty nice" to "Oh, something is seriously wrong," before blacking out. All of a sudden, I was walking down the stairs to my friend's basement. It was absolutely destroyed with stuff thrown everywhere, and empty bottles and syringes laying around. He was sitting there waiting for me on the couch, tears in his eyes. He just kept repeating that he was sorry, and he didn't want to hurt anyone. He said the money didn't last him long, and he's back to being his broke-ass self again. That he was sorry for bringing me there, and he just needed to say goodbye to someone before finally saying goodbye to me, and everything faded out in another wave of euphoria. Me being logical to a fault and pretty straightforward, I woke up the next morning thinking, damn, what a weird dream, but not much else. I wrote it down in a dream journal I was doing at the time and completely forgot about it. I ended up going to work and class like normal. Then a few hours later, I received a call from my friend's mum. She called me to break the news that my friend had passed away that night. Overdose. It wasn't until a few months later when another friend of mine, also ex-addict, was trying to console me by telling me how he went out with no pain, and how it was probably the best way to go when things started to get really weird. He started to explain to me what an overdose actually feels like, the overwhelming euphoria, and how it's impossible to explain to someone who's never experienced it, i.e. me. It was then that I realized what he was describing started to sound really familiar. I went to my phone and opened up my dream journal, and started to read the entry for a few months back to him out loud. He said, "Yeah, exactly. Where'd you get that story?" And I told him the whole thing. Both of us were at a loss for words, and I still am. As I said, I don't believe in this stuff, and if someone told me this story, I would say they were high as hell. But it's a memory nonetheless that I will never forget. I worked at a Boy Scout camp for 2 years in high school as a summer gig. A requirement for the Scouts is to earn their Wilderness Survival Merit Badge, and for this, they had to set up shelters along with other activities. Before I was staff, the Scouts would go 12 miles into the woods for their night out to a place called Shelby's Dream. The stories of kids waking up screaming, talking about seeing a ghost running at them and being hung from trees and other wild experiences were many. Everyone wrote those kids off and called them crazy. Eventually there were things people couldn't explain, such as staff members waking up with scratches and cuts on their body. The backstory of the place is that there was a mass killing of Southern soldiers during the American Civil War, and Shelby was the daughter of the Southern captain, who was hung with all his men. She supposedly came back to the camp to find her father and all his men hung from the trees. We stopped sending the group to that location a few years back. One night my cabin mates and I went out there to see if the rumors were true about that place. I heard voices, cries, and screams that echoed into the forest. There's a point where you cross a bridge, and once over the bridge the wilderness stops. The woods continue, but there's no noise for animals or insects. Absolute silence, and it's one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. I grew up on an island in Alaska, and I lived on the same property since birth to high school graduation. Our house was 2 stories, and the downstairs had a bathroom, furnace room, storage room, entryway, and rec room. One of the walls had some plywood pieces up so that we could feed extension cords through it into our crawl space. We had a C-shaped driveway that you would enter from one side and then park in the carport and then just drive forward towards the exit. The crawl space consisted of 2 big water tanks because we caught our own rainwater and used this area for storage. This space was 10 by 15 but only 3 foot high. You had to lift a cover up to get into the water tanks, and you could only enter the crawl space from the side of the house. It was a 2 by 2 door that we kept a master lock on, but never actually locked it. Our dog Brewster's area was on this side of the house as well. He had a big fenced area, his own stairway and porch, which was half covered, and he had a doghouse. Brewster weighed about 130 pounds, was a fantastic dog who only barked when necessary. During the summer, we had black bears in our yard most nights, and Brewster would give a quick bark to get them on their way, and we knew his barks. There are 4 of us in our family, my parents, myself, and my older brother, who is 2 years older and has Down syndrome. My brother was in special education at school, and there were other kids who would come into the same room, but just once in a while throughout the day, because they had a smaller disability and were able to keep up in some general classes, but some of the kids had discipline problems or mental illnesses. My brother was loved by the kids in school, and everyone knew him. One day, a native kid that was about 15 came to our door and wanted to play with Travis. We thought it was odd because Travis has moderate Downs, and he didn't really like playing with other kids. He liked watching kids play. Travis liked watching movies and listening to music, and my mum asked the kid what his name was, and he said that he was Mark, and that he knew Travis from junior high the year before, because he would go into Travis's class sometimes to help him with his schoolwork. I remember him staring at me a little bit too much, and he didn't seem like someone who was mentally challenged. My mum let him come in but kept a watchful eye. Travis seemed like he didn't want him there, and my mum told Mark that we were having dinner soon, and that it was time for him to go. My mum found out that he had moved into the area where we lived, but it was still a little ways away. He had been in and out of foster care most of his life. His parents were abusive addicts, and I think he came over another time and my mum felt bad for him, but she always felt like something was off, like he was coming over because of me. My mum politely told him that Travis didn't really want having visitors over, and he seemed okay with that and never returned. My parents went to a church service on Wednesday evenings and would always be gone a few hours. I would stay home with Travis. At the time I was 11 and he 13. And I started helping out in the church nursery when I was 9, and when I turned 11 my best friend and I took a babysitting course, which included CPR and first aid. We would babysit together at age 12, and started babysitting on our own. My mum was a homemaker, and was always home except for Wednesday's church service. My parents didn't drink, do drugs or smoke, and I can only remember my parents going out a few times when we needed a babysitter. I would leave the downstairs doors unlocked for my parents when they were going to be gone a few hours. I was expecting them home in about a half hour, and was surprised when I heard the downstairs door open, and I thought I must not have heard the car pull up, and Travis was up past his bedtime, so I quietly tell Travis to go to his bedroom and to get into bed. I start walking through the kitchen to the top of the stairs and I call out, "Mum? Dad?" and I hear the footsteps stop. And I'm looking down the stairs, and I think I could see men's work boots and jeans. These aren't my parents. The way the stairs were set up, you could only see the bottom half of someone without descending the stairs. I'm scared to death, and I turn to Travis, who was going down the hall, and I drag him and grab him to my parents' bedroom, because it's the only room that locks, has a phone and rifles. Down kids are very stubborn, so my brother just wants to go to his room, but I get him to sit down on the bed. I'm trying to keep him in the room while I grab a gun. I'm trying to call my neighbor, and I can hear him walking around downstairs still. My neighbor answers her phone immediately, and I whisper that someone was in my house and I was scared. She told me to come out the front porch and she'd be there. I get the courage to run to the door and get outside. Thankfully, she's in the driveway and has her dog with her. She lets me know that she's going to enter the house through the downstairs, and she disappears from sight but comes back quickly and tells me the door is locked, and she makes her way up the stairs, gets to the top when she hears the downstairs door open and the crunching of gravel, as the intruder is running off. She lets go of her dog's leash and the dog chased the person into the woods. The dog came back 10 minutes later, and our neighbor sat with us until my parents got home. The police were never called because I think my parents assumed it was a neighborhood boy screwing with me, and we lived in a safe place where you just had to worry about bears and an occasional wolf. A week after this incident, our dog would bark 15 minutes after we went to bed every night. We would look out the window and never see anything. We figured it was bears because it was springtime and Brewster was probably just getting used to them again. A few months, the barking still happened, and I had my best friend stay the night, and we would always lay in the downstairs so that we could be louder and stay up as late as we liked. Kate had a brother that was 7 years older, and we asked if he'd bring us some booze. I knew we were young, but that was the normal thing for our town. Kids started drinking, smoking, and doing it in the middle of school because of boredom. I think we got 13 feet of rain that year, so we would be inside a lot. It was a little after midnight, and her brother never showed up, and Brewster never barked that night either. We were sitting on the stairs braiding each other's hair when we both got a feeling of someone staring at us, and we looked over, and a guy was staring into the window. We ran up the stairs in panic. We thought maybe it was her brother, but he wouldn't have come up to the window to spy on us like that, and the face seemed too dark to be his. But we had the lights on in the downstairs, and there were no lights by that window outside, so it's hard to tell who it was. We didn't want to wake my parents up just in case it was her brother, and we waited 30 minutes and went back down to grab her stuff, and went to sleep in my bedroom for the night. The next day we spoke to her brother and it wasn't him, and that night, Brewster's nightly barking resumed. 2 more months go by, and I had gone to bed and heard Brewster bark when I looked out my window as usual and saw nothing. I had just dozed back off and woke up to Brewster barking frantically. I look up my window and see a guy running out of our driveway. I thought about walking into my parents' room, but we had a trail on the side of our house that kids used to get to the road behind us. The neighborhood was on the side of a mountain, so all the kids used trails to go through to another road instead of using the main road. I had never seen someone come out of another part of the driveway, because the trail was on the south side of the house along with the crawl space and Brewster's area. My room was the only room on the north side. I decided to go back to sleep, and as I was tossing and turning, 15 minutes go by when I smell smoke. I go to the hall and the smell is a lot stronger, and it's starting to get hazy in Travis's room, which was directly across from mine. I begin screaming fire, and my parents are up, and Travis doesn't want to get out of bed, but thank God for the strength of adrenaline. We get outside and the flames were pouring out of the crawl space. We get Brewster out of his enclosure, and the neighbors all come out to help us. The firemen were rather quick, but the fire had destroyed the crawl space and my parents' and Travis's bedrooms. Thankfully, the firefighters got the fire extinguished and no one was physically hurt. This was one of the scariest nights of my life though. I'll always remember the fire chief kneeling down to speak to me after he had talked to my parents when he said, "Melinda, we believe it was arson." I look at him with tears streaming down my face and I say in anger, "Who is arson?" And everyone started laughing so hard. And I'm thinking now how funny that was. That damn arson could have killed my family. So he explains what arson is, and I'm still friends with the old fire chief's son, and I share that story with him often, because his father passed away from cancer when we were teens. His father is the only happy memory I have from that horrific night. The island I grew up on had a city and a village out south. We lived out south, but before the village. We had firemen from out south, north, and the city. We had state troopers from the island and city cops in the city limits. My mum took my brother and I to our family friend's house, and my dad dealt with the fire officials and the state troopers that showed up after. After the investigation, my family, neighbors, and the firemen pieced together that a person had been living in our crawl space for 4 months. We knew he had set the house on fire on purpose. He used a box of matches. My mum said the first odd thing she noticed that night was the smell of sulfur. We knew who did it. It was Mark. His uncle was one of the firemen who first showed up at our house and saw him standing near our driveway watching. My mum had told him my description of what the person was wearing that I saw fleeing our house, and it was what he was wearing. Behind our house near the crawl space area, My dad found where he hung out when he wasn't in the crawl space. There were a bunch of cigarette butts, soda cans, which we also found in the crawl space, but because our crawl space wasn't locked, our insurance policy wouldn't have paid for the repairs. Because of our water tanks, the space was supposed to be locked. So my parents never said anything to the police, and the firemen never said anything. By pursuing this, we could not have a home, a house my father had built. It took 4 months for our house to be repaired, and it smelt like ozone years later. What bothers me the most is knowing he had seen me and my friends undress numerous times while changing in the rec room during tons of sleepovers. Where he had set up shop was right next to the plywood with the holes drilled through. He listened to all our secrets, and I never explained to my friends that he had seen us and heard us during our sleepovers because I didn't want them to feel sick to their stomachs, like I still do. I still have issues when it comes to being home alone. I can't sleep if I'm the only adult in the house, and I keep the volume on everything very low, and I'm scared to shower. I like to be able to see the front door, and I have night terrors to this day. I'm 34 now, and I've been dealing with anxiety since the fire and panic attacks since I was 18, and recently have been diagnosed with PTSD. When the intruder was in his early 20s, he was caught for burning down a few houses and was put in jail. All my childhood toys were stored in the crawl space, along with a lot of our family's sentimental possessions. I've been dealing with a possible neurological condition for the past year, and I lose my train of thought easy and struggle to find words that are simple. Thank you all so much for listening. I went to a Catholic school, and we had a school chaplain who was essentially some sort of friend to the kids. It sounds really creepy when you say it like that, but the dude was goddamn amazing. He talked multiple students out of suicide, helped tons of kids come to terms with and overcome bullying, harassment, and sexual/domestic abuse, as well as encouraging every single student to reach for their dreams. Anyway, he once went the extra mile for a very troubled family at my school. The two kids in question were adopted brothers, and both incredibly unstable. The brothers would be your best friend 1 second and then suddenly fly off the handle the next, making you literally fear for your own life. Anyway, knowing their family problems, the school chaplain volunteered to become the two boys' godfathers in order to legally be able to help them and their family out financially. About a year after I finished school, the school chaplain appeared in the local newspapers. He had been arrested for imprisoning and raping the older of the two lads. For most people, that was enough to condemn him, but most of the people I went to school with found the whole thing somewhat suspicious. Whenever someone encountered one of the two boys, they would instantly launch into a step-by-step recount of exactly what happened, as if desperate to convince everyone they knew that they were telling the truth. The only thing wrong was that these step-by-step accounts were usually vastly different each time they were told, as if poorly thought out. Regardless, the chaplain imprisoned and eventually died of cancer while still inside. It was only after his death that it finally came out that the rape never happened. The chaplain had run into financial trouble himself, and so was unable to keep giving the boy's family money. As punishment, the whole family, yes, the parents were the ones who came up with the idea, invented the story of rape to teach him a lesson. The guy was a hero. He even helped my girlfriend at the time get through her parents' divorce in one piece. And yet, his lot in life wound up with him sad, forgotten, name besmirched, and alone, to die of cancer in prison. When I was 18, I purchased my first home. It was a small rundown foreclosure home that I got for next to nothing, a perfect fixer-upper for my young son and I. My dad is a carpenter, and so he was able to do most of the updates for me before we moved in. Dad didn't tell me outright that anything supernatural ever happened to him, but on one occasion when I arrived to the house to help out, he asked me, "Was that you a little bit ago?" "No, I just got here," I replied, and he just shrugged. The other time he was under the house working on something and he kept hearing footsteps above him. Convinced it was my mum or I, he yelled a few times before assuming we couldn't hear him and gave up. I didn't chalk these up to paranormal experiences before, because I'd never had a paranormal experience and I wasn't even sure if I believed in them. Once my son and I moved into the house, I slowly started noticing odd occurrences. I constantly was thinking I heard the door to the breezeway open and close, and the sound of shuffling as if someone was arriving home. But of course, no one was ever there. The sound of footsteps upstairs was also very common. The first time my boyfriend came to the house and stayed the night, we were fast asleep when the stereo came on at full blast, scaring the hell out of us. The next morning we were sitting at the bar in the kitchen having breakfast, and we began discussing the previous night's events, and then my boyfriend proclaimed, "If there's really something in this house, I wish it would just show itself." As soon as he finished his sentence, we heard a loud crash, and we turned to look. A mini cooler was tumbling down the stairs with enough force that it left a dent in the wall at the bottom of the staircase. Another time, my boyfriend, our son, and myself were all sleeping in that living room. It was a very hot summer, and we didn't have central air conditioning at the time, so we had pulled the mattresses out on the living room floor where the window AC unit was. Around 3 a.m., we woke up to the sound of an alarm clock going off. We didn't use an alarm clock, so we jumped up to try and find the source of the noise so that it wouldn't wake our son. I'll never forget when I found it. I followed the noise to a plastic bag that was beside the couch that had some of my boyfriend's belongings in it, and pulled out an alarm clock. I was frantically hitting buttons trying to get it to stop before I decided to just unplug it. When I grabbed the cord, I realized it wasn't plugged into anything at all. I just held it, staring at it, and held it for my boyfriend to see before it stopped just as suddenly as it had started. The next day he inspected the clock, convinced it had batteries in it, but it didn't even have a battery compartment. This final story was the one that scared me the most. I was in the living room watching TV while my son slept upstairs. The baby monitor was beside me, and from my position, I could look straight up the stairs and see the door to my son's room. Well, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart across the upstairs hallway, and simultaneously there was a short burst of static interference on the baby monitor. The hairs on my arm stood straight up, and I stared up the stairs at my son's door. The hallway was illuminated by a nightlight, and my son's door was white, so I could see it fairly well. It looked like a head was peeking out from across the room to the hallway from my son's door, but I thought surely it was my imagination. Until after about a minute it stepped out. The thing that terrifies me the most was that it didn't glide across the floor like you see in the movies. Its movements were so human-like and distinct, and three-dimensional, that if it hadn't have been a black, stark silhouette, I would have thought it were an intruder. It stepped out the doorway and took a few steps across the hall to my son's door, then turned its head like it wanted to check if I was watching before it stuck its head in, and shoulders through my son's door as if to have a peek, to see what was in there. When it did, I mustered all the courage I could and just yelled out, "No!" and it pulled its head out and quickly dematerialized in such a strange way. It was like it shrunk into itself until there was nothing left. I have goosebumps just sharing this. I bounded up the stairs, grabbed my son, and left immediately. I stayed the night at my mum's house for about a week after that. Eventually I sold that house, and I've never had a chance to ask the owners if they've ever had any strange experiences there themselves.
Usually, I get sleep paralysis during the day, in a nap, if I'm on my back. And usually it's one of four things. An invisible entity trying to choke me and drag me around the room, up to the ceiling especially. 2, an invisible entity trying to assault me. 3, just a general falling or flying sensation. and sometimes it seems like I'm going to go through a wall or the floor, and I've pulled an Ant-Man and went subatomic or some stuff. The fourth kind is where I see people all around, whether they be strangers or friends or my significant other. Like it'll just be me home alone and it'll happen. And I'll just hear the sound of my significant other come home, clear his throat, kick his shoes off and sit in his unbearably squeaky desk chair. Or it'll sound like strangers may be walking in and out, and that they're all around me, but I can't make out what they're actually saying. In any case, one day I'm in the bedroom napping, and sleep paralysis happens. This time it sounds like there's a bunch of people walking back and forth outside the bedroom window, but I can't make out anything of what's being said. I'm trying to move, trying to hear the voices better, trying to just snap the hell out of it, but I'm not having any luck. Then, one male voice comes in clear as a bell and just says, "Poop." That broke the spell and I woke up laughing my ass off at the singular word. 10 out of 10 sleep paralysis experience, would gladly do over again, just for all the other kinds.
Many years ago, my now ex-husband and I purchased what used to be an old farmhouse. It was a unique old house that had been added onto many times over the years. We started updating it room by room and had been living there about a year before we began to work on the finished basement. I had 3 boys from my previous marriage who were 9, 11 and 14 that lived with us but visited their dad every weekend who lived about a mile away. The first project in the basement we planned on doing was to convert one of the good-sized storage rooms into a walk-in closet for seasonal clothing, sports equipment, etc. The previous owner had left several cheap metal shelving units behind in this room that we'd never moved but weren't part of the new design. The night before I was set to start on the project, the boys and I had rented videos and watched Stir of the Echoes with Kevin Bacon. From what I remember, the movie was about a dad character, Kevin Bacon, having dreams or visions about a young girl who had died and was trying to get him to find her and solve her murder. It wasn't too intense, but had a few suspenseful parts with jump scares and special effects. I recall the end being something about him digging in the basement and trying to find the dead girl, breaking through a blocked wall and discovering her behind some thick plastic sheeting or something like that. Predictable, but we all enjoyed it, especially my 11-year-old who loved scary movies. The next morning the boys all went to their dad's. The new husband goes to work and I start on the storage room project. The walls in this room are covered in thin paneling, so I start moving the metal shelving out so that I can begin work, and I see that the paneling on one side of the walls behind the shelving isn't snug against the wall like the rest. It's kind of gaping a bit at the bottom. I take a closer look and see a very small slide lock, like a miniature deadbolt, cut into the paneling and a distinct cutout like door. What the hell? We have a secret room, how cool! I can't keep this discovery all to myself, so I run upstairs and call the boys at their dad's. Eric, the 11-year-old, answers his phone and I tell him what I found in the basement. Both of his brothers are at their friends' houses, but he's super excited to check it out, and jumps on his bike and zooms home all sweaty from pedaling so fast. This is exactly the kind of thing Eric loves. We go back into the basement. I slide the lock and pry the door open with a screwdriver. The first thing we see is a thick plastic sheeting, just like the one we'd seen in the movie the night before. Holy hell. We slam it shut and start laughing. He says we've got to be brave, Mum, so I go find a razor knife and slice through the plastic. Inside is a small room with a sandy dirt floor that has several old TV sets and buckets of old glass tubes and an old desk with newspapers in it. No dead body or Kevin Bacon to be found, but we sure had fun going through the desk and laughing about the secret room that we called the Stir of Echoes room from that point on. My father-in-law said that it was an old-fashioned root cellar that was used to store root vegetables like potatoes back in the day. What a strange coincidence that we had watched that movie just the night before. When I was around 11, we went camping. It was the first time I did it. According to the schedule, we were supposed to listen to a person tell scary stories, but for whatever reason they never showed. So, as our final evening activity, we went on a night hike instead. The walk was pretty normal and actually quite fun, until we stumbled upon these cute little fairy homes built into a tree. We all looked at the tiny houses and noticed you could open one of the doors, so we looked inside and found what was rather spooky. It was a note saying back in 5. Now this may not seem that scary, but just you wait. We carried on and kept walking. Later on we stumbled upon a lake, and we looked across it, shining our light so that we could see, and saw something rather strange. Parked on the opposite side were a few vans and cars facing us. We were instantly spooked, and to make things worse, we started to see people walk around. You could tell something wasn't right, because even the teachers seemed to be scared and nervous. The doors of the van were open, and I believe something was inside, but I can't remember. Nevertheless, it scared us more and more, and soon after we left and headed back to the fairy/gnome houses. On our way back, curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check if the note was still there. It was not, and that sent shivers down our spine. We left straight away, and for the rest of the night we wondered who took the note. I doubt it was one of my fellow classmates because we were all looking at it, and I doubt anyone would have taken it.
This happened to me in the summer of 2009. I was at a 6-week Air Cadet band camp, and basically, it was the most messed up 6 weeks of my life. Second night there, we're lying in our bed in the barracks. There's 8 of us to a room, and we're awake, and just about midnight talking about girls and texting. One guy called Alex is the only one sleeping and is lying on the bottom bunk next to the door. Suddenly he moans and's like, "Guys, why am I drinking?" We all burst out laughing, but then he flipped on the light, and he was covered in blood. So we call the sergeant to change his sheets and shirt, and they flip off the light while he's cleaning himself in the bathroom. We lay there, staring up, waiting for Alex's return. When he does, he flips on the lights, then he turns them off again once he's in bed. This time we notice there's a weird glow on the ceiling. The dude on Alex's top bunk, called Brad, starts freaking out and jumps off his bed. Naturally, we all jump off our beds too, to see what he's tripping about. On the ceiling in glow-in-the-dark letters are the words, "Die, Adam," and it looks like it has blood spattered around it. By the way, Adam was the name of a kid who supposedly committed suicide years ago in that very same barrack block. Bear in mind those letters were definitely not there before he returned from his nosebleed cleanup. We freaked out and yelled for the sergeants and basically didn't sleep that night. That's just the beginning. Fast forward a few weeks and a bunch of us, Alex and Brad included, are chilling in a room. Enter Sergeant Williams looking very pissed off. He mentions that a friend of his recently got shot in a gang-related something or other. His reaction is to sit down cross-legged and start chanting in some language. One kid, called Simon, says, "You're gonna burn yourself out." Sergeant Williams says, "No, I have more than you think." Now the rest of us don't have any idea what the hell's going on, so we start laughing, while he does this weird snapping then patting the ground thing. Angry, he tells us he's chanting in Gaelic, and that he can manipulate energy with his mind. We're all like 17, 14-year-olds, so we burst out laughing. He beckons me over and tells me to put out my hand, and I oblige, and he hovers his hand over mine, and I'm like, what the hell is this? And then my hand turns really hot, and I retract it quickly. I'm scared, so I just leave the room. A few minutes later, Sergeant Williams tracks each of us down and tells us that if we tell anyone, he will, no joke, end us. I nod and keep silent. I'm easily bullied. But Alex and one of his friends go straight to the sergeants. I wasn't there, but from what Alex told me, I gathered that Alex and his friend were put into lockdown, while the police came and took a struggling Sergeant Williams away. We heard rumors that he was temporarily moved to an asylum. One more weird thing happened. We were about 4 weeks into the camp. It was Saturday and it was windy as hell. They wouldn't let us out of our barracks because apparently there was a tornado warning, and they had put us on standby and that we may be moving to the basement. So we all sat in the halls polishing our boots and singing Amazing Grace while the power went out. It was like a movie because there was lightning and stuff and people were hysterical. Suddenly, some idiot at the window starts freaking out and a bunch of us run over to see what's outside. Now, I didn't get to see it, but people say they saw a very Sergeant Williams-looking like figure standing in the middle of the field behind our barracks staring at us. Some serious horror movie kind of stuff. It was awesome and horrifying at the same time. Craziest 6 weeks ever.
When I was a kid, I saw something. I was laying in my bed, the room door in front of me wide open, and to the left I could see the room where the front door was. There was an antique cabinet that my dad had that illuminated a white glow. I started to freak out for no reason and started sweating. I, for some reason, knew crap was about to happen and I was about to witness something. About 5 minutes later, hot in sweat, I saw it. There was a door in the back of the room with the front door that was storage. A black, outlined humanoid figure walks out, mildly static looking. It takes a few steps towards the front door, then stops, does a military-like turn and faces me. At this point, I'm losing it. It walked into my room and stops beside my bed. Does one more military turn, facing me, and at that point I figure, what have I got to lose? I noped the hell out and ran through the thing, ran upstairs to my parents' bedroom, and knocked furiously at the door, waiting for them to let me in. My eyes focused on the stairs, making sure it wasn't to follow me. Nothing. I slept with my parents the next few nights. It's one of the scariest things that happened to me as a child. A short time after the shadow people encounter, I began to settle down, and my thoughts were no longer fearful. I also believe this was during the time I put up a dream catcher that my mother got me. Let's just say the dream catcher really did the job for years, maybe because I truly believed in it, and my mind worked in its favor. One day I woke up in the morning to Mum yelling down the stairs for me to get up. It was a school day. I had a shower, came back to my room and sat on my bed, sluggishly slipping on my school uniform. And this is when it gets creepy. As I was pulling up my socks, I noticed a flash outside my door, more towards the room with the front door. Not the bright camera type flash, but more like an invisible person walking past super fast my front door. For those of you who have played Halo, it looks like someone walking around with the invisibility cloak, but real fast past my door. You can still see them, but not entirely. I saw this from the corner of my eye and began to freak out. I went upstairs to eat breakfast and remember how scared I was, and sat there staring down at the table as I ate my cereal. My mother asked what was up, and I looked up at her with a straight face and said something along the lines of, "I saw a flash by the door downstairs. Something walked past my door." I said this calmly and with a straight face, and now that I look back, it must have looked like I was the classic creepy kid. My mum just said, "It's all in your head," and I went back to eating, and she went to the laundry room behind the kitchen. And that's when it happened again. I was eating when I saw another flash of an invisible person walk past the kitchen door. This time I was paralyzed, as in I stopped chewing and was now staring straight down at the table. Whatever these things were, they were playing with me. My mum walks in, stops, sees my reaction, and again I calmly say, "It just did it again. Over there," pointing at the kitchen threshold. I tell my mum that something's playing with me and that I'm not imagining things. What really relieved me but freaked me out at the same time was her reply. "I know." It relieved me because she believed me, but she freaked me out because she basically confirmed their existence. About 10 seconds later, we both heard someone walking down the stairs. They're wooden, so the creaks can be heard. It was very slow. I remember thinking to myself it sounded as if their cover's blown, and they're trying to sneak out. My mum and I both looked at each other, and once we heard it, it stopped. She looked around the corner down the stairs and there was nothing. Dad had already left for work. My Filipino cousins, as I'm half Filipino, and I were gathered around the TV. Some of them on the floor, one on the back couch and me on the couch by the sliding door. We were all watching either a game show or something overly bubbly. At the time it was getting late for us, about 10 p.m. or so. And here's where the realest stuff goes down. I'm sitting on the couch with my legs up and one knee up. The remote is dangling on the backrest, edge to the right, and I hear it drop behind me. So little me, being the ninja I am, slides over to the top of the couch on my back, like a bridge stretch for your back, with my face pressed up against the glass. I grab the remote, and from the corner of my eye I see a little girl with black hair. She had a white dress on and was looking down, so I couldn't see her face. She was in a crawling position, backing up like she'd been caught trying to escape. She was backing up towards the middle of the room, towards the Christmas tree. I was still upside down at this point when I managed to look over at her and she vanished. I scuttled right back up and then jumped. All my cousins looked at me in confusion, and then I explained to them what I saw, and they basically started shaking their fingers and pointing at me, as if they knew that I must have done something to see something. They were smiling though, as if it were a completely normal thing to experience. To this day I still think that they were just messing with me with the whole "you got in trouble with the supernatural," but I know what I saw. I've always been scared crapless whenever I was in the Philippines, especially that house. In the area we live in, Betis, this house was like a mansion. It was opposite some basketball courts, in case anyone knows Betis. Anyway, if anyone ever goes to the Philippines, be sure to ask the locals for some supernatural stories. I'd imagine people there have had their share, as all my Filipino relatives have, including our maids. One maid ran away once because of an encounter. She came back, and I've met her before, but she just hates talking about it.
I am a skeptic in general, and don't buy into the paranormal stuff. But something happened to me in college that I can't quite explain, to the point that I remind myself a few times every year that it actually happened. I was sleeping over at my girlfriend's house, and for a few nights I had been having a very similar nightmare. The fact I was having nightmares at all was odd in itself. I rarely remembered my dreams at that point in my life, but suddenly I was having them all the time. The dreams themselves were terrifying. I don't remember all the details, but I clearly remember the source of my fear. It was very tall and spindly, with thin arms and legs and the head of a dog. It kind of looked like an Egyptian Anubis. I remember that it would sort of dance towards me in my dream with its arms waving wildly above its head, almost like it had one of those air-driven advertisements that they put in front of car lots to get your attention as you drive by. Sounds dumb when I type it out, but it was scary enough that it still fills me with a sense of dread. And we're talking 15 years later here. All of this is explainable. Until one night, I was having the dream again, and woke up right around the time I usually did. Only this time I was awoke, not just with residual terror, but also with an overwhelming sense that something was very wrong and that I was in imminent danger. I looked over at my girlfriend, just in time to see her eyes snap open. We look at each other and just know to get out. We flip on the lights, and here's where I begin to double doubt myself and have to constantly remind myself that yes, it did happen, and froze. All around the room are my girlfriend's hats. There's one on the lamp, a few on the floor, one on the exercise bike, one on the desk, and when we went to sleep, they were all in a box. We stood there a moment in shock, all the while inside my head, I just get the feeling that we need to get out, but we don't say a word. We just looked at each other, both white as a sheet. We turned and got the hell out of her apartment, not even pausing to putting shoes on, and we didn't sleep over there again. I never had that dream again. and to this day I have no idea what the hell to think about it, but I don't want to forget it either.
I went to a high school that was built years ago, maybe 200 to 300 years ago to be exact. Me and my friend noticed these hatches were about 6 feet off the floor next to all these toilets. For context, the school was based around a quad, so there was a toilet down some stairs at each corner of the quad. Obviously we had to check these hatches out, so we did during a drama lesson that we snuck out of. We got in there, and there was a corridor under the actual corridor, which was only about 4 to 5 feet tall, so we had to crawl through it. The corridor connected all the toilets and the vents atop of the walls that were at skirting board level in the classrooms, so we could watch lessons go on, which was cool. There were tons of pipes and electrical wires and other non-interesting stuff that you would expect, apart from in one corner of the quad. The hatch for this one was locked from the inside, and all the pipes had gone back into the wall or stopped, so the wall was bare, just concrete slabs rather than bricks, which was odd. There was a small gap at the bottom of the wall that I could only just fit through. It was a struggle crawling under, as we had our mobiles for torches and I'm not the smallest of people. When we got through, it felt so much colder in this opening than it did in the corridor. The space was also much more spacious as we could stand up, and the lights from our torches didn't light up the opposite side of the room when we shone them through, which made it seem like our torches weren't even on. The room smelt really bad, and we saw what looked like a decomposing cat, which was now just mostly bone and some fur, at the next side of the wall closest to us. More freakily, there was this weird stone arch above the cat, and some red writing that wasn't blood but was pretty creepy. It was a few years ago, but I vaguely remember it saying something along the lines of, "If you are found here, the school will expel you, but Lucifer will do far worse." There were a few scratches on the wall, and some symbols that we thought were letters, but we couldn't make them out. We took some pictures and got the hell out of there really quickly, because we were crapping ourselves at this point. It was a fairly prestigious school, so expulsion was probably the scariest thing that could happen at that point. This was about 5 years ago. The pics were on an old phone that I can't get anymore. I would love to see them myself just one last time. I used to work at a summer camp. The scariest thing that's ever happened was during one of my stories with 15 campers around the fire. The other staff members working with me interrupted me mid-story, which I thought was for dramatic effect, to tell me to be quiet and listen. We heard some howls far away from coyotes, but we didn't worry about coyotes since they're usually so small and timid. As I began to tell the story again, no more than 15 seconds later, another 3 howls came from the state woods around us, just closer this time. This continued until it felt like the howls were only 100 yards away, when they abruptly stopped. At this point the kids had kind of panicked, and I was getting a little uneasy due to the proximity of them. But once again, I don't usually worry about coyotes since they're so timid. As we sit in silence, we waited to see what would happen. Not 2 minutes later, the calls started again, louder and closer. The first call came from around 100 feet into the woods in front of us. The second call came to our left, same distance, and the last 2 came from right behind us, around 50 feet or so from the fire, to the point that we could see the coyotes at the tree line. At this point, the kids are crying, and myself and a co-worker stand up to try and scare them away. The coyotes at the back entrance of the woods actually stand their ground and growl at us. So we grab the nearest logs we can find and howl back, chasing them away, and ended up chasing them through the woods and found their den the next day about 3 miles up a hill, filled with bird feathers and bones. Cool stuff happened working at that camp. I miss it. Nothing really creepy happened except for maybe a mountain lion call here and there, and some faint rhythmic drums in the woods that we heard. But we guessed it could have just been some kids, right? One day I wasn't feeling that well at work, so I asked my bosses and they told me I could leave early. I was getting a really bad migraine. On my way home, I turned on my high beams. The back road I was on has no streetlights, and it was around midnight. My headlights lit up all the tall trees on the road, and I could see perfect colors with my lights. Out of nowhere, this figure walks out of the side of the road, solid black, not transparent and no details, just literally black, around 6 foot tall, and had what I can only describe as flashlight eyes. He just stared at me. I couldn't see any other details, even with high beams on, just his eyes. No nose, mouth, ears, even an outline. He was just a solid black silhouette. And then he just turned and ran into the forest at an unnatural speed. Thought I was seeing things, and I went home to my fiancée shaking. I was too scared to get out the car. He tried calming me down and making me feel better, and he said maybe I was just tired and seeing things. Maybe it was nighttime hypnosis. A few days later we had friends over. We're sitting there scrolling through apps looking for a good movie to watch, and I look at my fiancée and friend, and they both turn and look out the back door window. They jump up screaming. My friend ran to me with tears streaming down her cheeks, and I was confused. My fiancé ran into the other room, grabbed a gun and ran out the back door. A few moments later he came back in shaking. I asked him what was wrong. I was severely confused at this point because we have a 6 foot tall wooden fence, and I was trying to tell them animals can't get into our backyard without making a lot of noise if they tried. They both at the same time told me, flashlight eyes. I thought they were pranking me, and my friend wouldn't sleep in any of our guest rooms because of it being near the window, and we all ended up sleeping in the living room together. I haven't seen flashlight eyes since. What could he possibly be? I've looked up ghosts, cryptids, demons, everything. It looks like it's the rake, but from as far as I can tell, that's supposed to be white. It was a bit like the rake but solid black with no detail or anything. Like a child's drawing if they filled in a character with a black shape. And then its shining eyes. I didn't believe in the paranormal until this incident. My first sighting was 3 miles from my house. I don't know how this thing found me or kept up with me. I was going 50 miles an hour over hills and turns, scared out my mind. These extremely disturbing events happened at my high school in the 1980s, some 7 or 8 years prior to when I went. My brother's high school principal arranged for an English teacher to murder another English teacher and her kids. The teacher was murdered. The kids were never found. The principal went to prison. He's out now. And the murdering teacher died in prison. It's unclear why it really happened, but there are rumors of a love triangle and insurance payouts. Her children were never found, but there was a rumor of them being burnt in the school incinerators, which were quite large. Principal Smith was released because of misconduct by the prosecutor/police, but he died shortly after being released. And it goes to follow that the same school produced a murderer who raped and killed a mum and her infant daughter. I knew this kid really well, and was honestly not surprised when it happened. His name, Caleb Fairley. A while back, a friend of mine moved into a new house by the docks. The first time I was walking up to the side door, I noticed a small, old-looking door on the side wall of the raised porch. I inquired, and all they could tell me was that they called it the rape dungeon, and that they had never been in there. I think there was some creepy story to go with it involving a small child. I told the guys we needed to find out what was inside there, but soon forgot after looking around the house. The next time I went over, I again insisted that we needed to make our way into that room and find whatever goodies it had in store for us. An hour or two later, we ended up in front of the house having a smoke, and it seemed like the perfect time to bust in. We found some tools to break the old rusted lock and got to it. 10 or so minutes later, the lock was off, and we were peering into a dark, low-roofed room, not being able to see more than 2 feet in front of us. Someone saw a light switch and flicked it, revealing a small room that looked like it hadn't been touched in many years. A big wooden barrel/vat lay to the left, the kind they make whiskey and such in. On the right was a small metal can with coiled copper tubing through it, a huge mixing rod of some sort, and some weird-looking pillboxes. As soon as I saw the coiled copper pipe, I realized what we had stumbled on. A moonshine dungeon. The whole room looked as though it had been dug out by hand, with concrete pavers laid dodgily on the floor, and in front of us another opening in the brick wall that led to a room with a wire bed frame on one side, and stacked the roof with large old bottles on the other. We were pretty excited at this point, to say the least. We started poking around as you do, find some old Playboy mags and other weird bits and bobs. I was expecting the barrel that was on its side, when I knocked out one of the chonks that kept it from rolling around. I went to pick it up from behind where the tile was, and I saw a plastic bag or something of the sort poking out from under the sand. So as you do when on a treasure mission, I started to pull, and this is where things get really interesting. I get the bag up and find that there's another bag inside and another, and this goes on for 40 to 50 bags before we reach a completely see-through bag that has some weird black-looking thing inside. At first we thought it might be heroin or something, but after peeling the plastic back, a wallet was revealed. So now we're getting really excited. We walk outside into the light and see a wad of $100 notes, thicker than I'd seen in a while, and they add up to around 17,000. That was a day I'll never forget. We ended up splitting the money. The serial number showed the earliest notes were only from around 15 years ago. In any case, free money. I used to teach outdoor education, which was essentially just summer camp during the school year, and school groups would come up and spend a few days at the camp. On their last night, we would always tell them scary stories around the campfire. It was the same scary story every time. We worked in partners, so there would always be 2 staff members for every school group and make scary noises. So I'm telling the story, and every few minutes there's a snap of a twig or a rustle in the bushes. And of course, as always, the kids get all freaked out and they start getting scared. It's very fun. Well, as I'm telling a story, I'm walking around the campfire, looking at all the kids' faces, and I notice a familiar one, my partner Eric, sitting there smiling at me, wondering why I'm staring at him. My heart has never beat so fast in my life. Eventually I sped through the story and all the kids left, and I explained to Eric that I thought it was him in the woods, and his eyes got very wide and he said, "Are you telling me that it wasn't one of the staff members?" So we both ran back to the main road. A guy killed himself in one of the girls' bathrooms about 9 years ago. A friend and I were the first to realize that the guy was dead and not just sleeping on the job or something. He apparently committed suicide by overdosing on heroin and was found with several syringes and empty tubes when they went to inspect everything. We, being the 15-year-old girls that we were, freaked out about seeing a dead body propped up against a toilet. It was all really surreal that a man would choose to do it on school grounds inside the girls' room. I think he was identified as one of the security guards who patrolled the freshman area. My friend and I passed by the man several times before we suspected anything was up. The moment I got a closer look and noticed his hands and face were really pale and almost blue. I then let out a small scream because holy hell,
A dead person in a high school girl's bathroom. I think he sat there dead for maybe an hour, maybe more, before anyone, myself included, decided to do something. I didn't want to try and wake him up just in case he was in a bad mood, or he didn't want anyone to know he was in there. The 5 minutes we get as a break between classes was when my friend and I decided to let our teachers and other security guards know what was happening. And the way our school bathrooms are set up, the store's located in a separate station away from where the sinks are, so nobody worries about anyone being able to see them do their business. In the whole area where the sinks are, there's a bench along the back wall facing the mirrors. Occasionally we see one of the security guards, male or female, just sitting at the bench and get some rest during breaks, which is understandable because the bathroom my friend and I often use, and the one where we found the dead guy, is almost always empty and quiet. Everyone's pretty cool with the security guards and no one really cares. The day my friend and I walked in and noticed someone quiet in one of the stalls, we just thought it was one of our regular security guards who decided to sit in the dark for a change. Guess we were wrong. I used to get sleep paralysis a lot. One night I had a lucid dream. It started out that I was at work and I had super strength. I've had dreams like this before, and usually no one cared that I had superpowers. But this time everyone was admiring me like I was a real hero. I got hurt on the job and had to go see the boss. At first I was talking to the boss and things seemed normal, general questions about the injury and stuff. Then he asked me, "What do you think about the powers I've given you?" And his face looked off somehow, just wrong. At this point I realized I was dreaming, but I couldn't get out of it, or rather I didn't wake up. It just kept going while he started offering me more power if I wanted it. I didn't know how to explain it, but I didn't feel like this was coming from my subconscious. It felt external and sinister. Feeling like my soul was in jeopardy, I grabbed him and threw him through this door that appeared. It was a door to the void. I felt like I'd passed a test, and before I could think too much, the secretary at our work came and stood in the doorway. She started praising me for turning down temptation for power, but she just kept getting more and more seductive. Just like before, I felt this was sinister, and out of nowhere I threw her at the door too. In that moment I snapped awake, breathing heavily, and actually feeling proud of some sort of accomplishment. I felt like I'd passed 2 tests of temptation, and again feeling proud of it I was about to tell my girlfriend who was laying beside me. In that moment, I suddenly became paralyzed, just like sleep paralysis, except I was awake when it hit me. My eyes were open, and I was in the same world, but outside I could hear terrible things like screaming, as people were being attacked and killed. I could visualize basically our world, but everything about it was violent and terrifying. Meanwhile, while paralyzed, I could feel something horrible flying towards my window to take me away. By this point I was actually crying so hard my girlfriend woke up and started shaking me to snap out of it. As soon as I got out of it I held her crying and told her what happened. The whole experience made me feel like I'd been challenged with the temptation of power, then lust, and those who had failed I'd forgotten about the last tool of the devil, so to speak, fear. This all happened the better part of 20 years ago now, and I remember it as clearly as ever. It's worth noting that I have never been a very religious person, and this was the first time I'd ever entertained the idea of being tempted by the devil or whatever, and was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever been through. On a side note, a year later Constantine came out in theaters, and it made me raise an eyebrow at the concept of hell being another dimension similar to Earth. The hell in Constantine was much different than the one I saw in my paralysis, but again, it was the concept that caught my attention in a way that was perhaps more meaningful than most.
When I was in high school, my parents decided to relocate our family to a big house in what felt like the middle of nowhere, and I swear to you it was haunted. It's up on a hill, isolated with no neighbors around for miles. Just going up our driveway was pretty long. The previous owner had inherited the place from his parents who had died, but he lost the house after struggling with his addiction. The property was foreclosed, and there was all kinds of weird stuff drawn on the walls when we moved in, so we gutted and renovated the entire home. From what I learned watching Supernatural, renovation is apparently a surefire way to wake up any angry spirits. Well, I was already a pretty paranoid kid, but this new house crept me out to no end. It had large windows in every room that pointed to the groves. We didn't have any blinds or covers or drapes, so I always felt like I was being watched. I'd be home alone on multiple occasions and hear a cupboard door slam shut very loudly, or hear pounding footsteps going up and down the stairs. I would literally lock myself in the bathroom, the only room in the entire house without a window, until a family member came home when this happened. Just weird noises and always feeling like I'm being watched. The worst experience was when I went to attend a Halloween party in my junior year. I dropped off my sibling at the dance to realize I had left an important part of my costume behind. I drove back home to retrieve said item, and the moment I walked through the door, something just felt wrong. I was home alone, and the house was dark. My body entered fight or fright mode, and for no apparent reason, I felt totally freaked out. So I ran inside, grabbed what I needed, and ran back to my car at record speed. As I raced down the driveway, shaking and crying, my nerves a complete mess, I looked behind me and saw that a dark figure was standing in the window of our house, watching me. Now I don't know how. I knew the figure was there, but my body sensed it before I actually saw him in the window. I'm just glad I got out in time, and I sure as hell didn't sleep that night. I still get freaked out just thinking about it, and I'm glad that I don't live there anymore, because it just had such negative energy about it. I also want to add something completely different, but somewhat related. One of my classmates was obsessed with Michael Jackson, and one day in class he kept telling everyone that Michael Jackson was going to die tomorrow. Sure enough, the next day, the news announced that he had passed. When I was in Boy Scouts, my troop would always go to a camp called Camp Taquitz for our yearly summer camp. That specific year they had an abnormal bear activity in and around the camp. It was a pretty sizable camp, but it was still way out in the boonies, so an encounter with a chipmunk was just as common as it would be with a California black bear. Wildlife management was done by some crazy old gunnery sergeant that we called Gunny, so you can see the situations you might find yourself in. I was tenting with a friend who had just joined the troop called James. He and I were sleeping in our tent in the middle of the night, must have been around 1 or 2 in the morning, when I was abruptly awoken by something. Everything is dead silent, aside from a plasticky creaking sound. Then I see it right above my head. Something was pushing the tent in so hard that it began to cave in right above, like something was leaning on it with all of their weight, except these tents were relatively strong. I mean, I could as a preteen jump on them and you'd just bounce right off. So being the scared little 13-year-old I was, I began to smack whatever it was with all my might, while simultaneously clubbing James with my fist to get him to wake up. Mind you, James is an incredibly deep sleeper, so this effect does nothing. Whoever or whatever it is was leaning so hard that it was almost touching my head. When James woke up from the nightmare he was having, he let out a blood-curdling, 10-year-old girl being murdered in the woods type scream. Whatever it was stopped leaning on the tent and vanished silently into the night. So for a few years, James, who had no recollection of the event whatsoever, and I always assumed it was a bear after the meds in my day pack. But after staffing at the camp and getting to know the law of the grounds a little better, I think something else may have been afoot. There have been many strange happenings around the camp, both paranormal and just normally unexplained. There's the usual Bigfoot and ghost stories, but older scouts and even administrative higher-ups claim to have seen things. Claims of Wendigo, Skinwalker, hybrid things, some dead guy called Drag Thump, and a bunch of Native American myths.
and the fact that there are no tears in the tent flap from the bear claws. We were the furthest away from the bear box. The fact that there was absolutely no sound from the supposed bear, as black bears make a hell of a lot of ruckus, and the fact that it was just persistently leaning on the tent instead of clawing at it like most bears tend to do, made me believe it was no Yogi or Smokey. It did not behave like bears do, and even if it was some older scout attempting to play a joke on us, they wouldn't have been heavy enough to lean that far into the tent, and probably would have erupted into laughter right after. Plus, my troop isn't like that. It's full of a bunch of mild-mannered city boys, perfect Eagle Scout material. Everything just seemed off. I lived in an apartment complex for 7 years, middle to high school, and experienced a lot of weird stuff with many witnesses. But the most unnerving was this. I was laying in bed just getting comfortable. I was rolled onto my side facing the wall, when I felt someone sit on the bed behind me. I thought perhaps my mum had come in, and I turned to look, but there was no one. I could still feel the dip in my bed. The door was closed, the light was off. I was totally alone. I was freaked out so much that I rolled back over and stared at the wall, trying to get the courage to reach over and turn the lamp on. Or suddenly I feel whatever was sitting there lay down and put an arm around me. I felt the pressure of an arm on my side. I felt the dip of weight behind me. I was too scared to move at that point since I didn't want to turn around and see what was there. Eventually I fell asleep, and nothing strange happened the next morning.
I was a camp counselor in a remote area. Former campers and counselors had always told me that the camp was haunted, but I didn't really believe in that nonsense. Anyway, it was the last night of the session, and I had a cabin of 9 to 10-year-olds. I woke up in the middle of the night to one of the kids sitting in my bed. I was a little groggy, but I remember him getting up and walking outside, and I was like, crap, I've got to go after him and get him back in the cabin. I remember the door opened noiselessly, and that was the last I saw of him. As soon as this happened, I woke my co-counselor and told him that a kid left the cabin and that I was going to go after him. I opened the door and it squeaked like hell, and then I tripped over a bunch of suitcases that were at the stoop. It was the last day of the session, and we always put the kids' suitcases out there so they would get picked up early in the morning and loaded onto the bus home. I searched all around the cabin and in the surrounding area for about 5 minutes. I then heard my co-counselor calling me in a hoarse whisper, so I ran back to the cabin. I just counted all the kids. They're all here. I still don't know what I saw that night. Was it a ghost kid? On my bed? My school was old. It was built at the time when the coup d'etat was very common in my country. For those of you who don't know, that is when the army overthrows a democratic government and seizes power, sometimes violently. So violent, in fact, that some coups had armed fighting in it, in the streets or air raids. This is why, when my school was built, they decided to add a bomb shelter in the basement for safety reasons. Time went by, and thankfully the shelter was never necessary for its original purpose, so the school started to store old furniture and various other things down there, and it was sort of used like a huge basement. Try to imagine a basement the size of a tennis court. But enough background. I started school in the mid-90s, and since the first time I saw the basement gate, it gave me the creeps. It was at the very end of a long hallway, and since it was only composed of iron bars, you could see half the stairs then the landing, and nothing more. Imagine a prison cell, but instead of a cell, there's a stairway. That's how it looked. It was creepy, but nobody thought much of it, since it was in a secluded part of the building, and it was always closed with a huge lock. One day when I was around 6 or 7, I was at recess when I heard a commotion coming from the basement hallway. When I got there was a big crowd of kids standing and pushing in front of the gate, trying to get in. The gate was open. From time to time, one of the kids would get out of the basement, make his way through the other kids, and run away in terror. Try to picture the scene. There was something down in the basement and everyone was pushing their way inside because they wanted to see it. But when they finally did see it, they fled in horror. I stood there for a while watching the chaos until I spotted one of my classmates coming out the basement running. I chased after him and finally caught up to him and asked him what was going on. To this day, I don't truly believe him. He said inside the basement, moving around trying to hide behind the old furniture and boxes, was a dwarf. He said it was smaller than a kid, had a long, dark beard, and bark-like grey skin, long ears, thin, long hair, and ragged clothes. Of course, I had to see this myself, but by the time I came back to the basement gate, it was already closed, and the teachers were trying to calm the kids down. There was a lot of commotion in the school during the next few days about the whole issue. Many parents complained about it, and the school authorities tried to play it down, saying it was just another kid trying to play a prank, whereas others weren't so sure. They said that this thing walked, and the sound couldn't have been made by another kid. There was even a girl that said it tried to grab her by the ankle and take her deeper into the basement. After that, the gate was covered by a wooden board so you couldn't see the stairs anymore. Sometimes I think about the incident, because I would really like to know what actually happened that day. Was it really a kid in a costume trying to scare the school? Was it a homeless man that wandered into the basement and was using it as a shelter? Or was it just a case of mass hysteria? Or could it be possible that something far stranger happened that day and we don't have an explanation for it?
About a year ago, I woke up bright-eyed in the middle of the night. I was on my side facing my husband, and the closet on the other side. For a clearer picture, we had taken down the closet doors when we moved in, since we hated bifold doors, and just hung a curtain that always drew aside. We have 2 long hanging baths for clothes all the way across the double closet, one across the top for his, and midway down across for my clothes. When I woke up, I was already staring at a spot about midway. There was this scaly black demon with red eyes perched on my hang bar, while holding with one arm the top bar, where his head reached between 2 jackets. He just sat there staring at me with his mouth open and very slowly started moving and creeping down towards the closet like he was moving towards my husband. I couldn't do anything except watch with my eyes pounding to my ear. I must have snapped out of it at some point because I blinked and it was gone. I finally could move and got the courage to get up and move over to the closet. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, of course. I didn't want to close the curtains, I guess, because I figured if it came back it would be better to see it moving instead of wondering if something was behind the curtain. It had to be sleep paralysis. No idea why, but it damn freaked me out for a good few nights after that.
I grew up in a very small, strange, almost cultish Christian church. It was labelled non-denominational. They were pretty out there in what they believed. After the service every week, for anywhere between 3 to 5 hours, everyone stayed to receive prayer. On many occasions, there were exorcisms performed during this time. I personally witnessed people I'd known my entire life going into trance-like seizures with evil voices coming out their mouths. These voices made the hair on my neck stand on end. I knew they were really demons because they were so opposite of anything these people would say in real life. It was pure evil. I saw these people screaming, writhing, and foaming at the mouths. I was horrified. I would never forget the screams. There's no question in my mind, I was seeing demons. One time in particular, I remember this incident with a member of the church called Sam, who was a father of a few of our friends. He was a very nice, funny man, and all the kids liked him a lot. One day he received prayer, and demons began to manifest out of him. It got so intense, the kids were sent out of the room, but we all listened at the door, and this man screamed like he was being murdered. We were scared, crying, thinking he was going to die. I was 8 years old. We left this church when I was around 10, and about a decade later I sort of walked away from religion in order to find what I really believed in. I'm going to share with you an incident that I've never told anyone except my therapist, because I'm afraid they'll think I'm insane. This occurred during my period of searching and questioning religion, when I was 24 and just married. My mother-in-law invited me to what she called the deliverance service that she had attended the previous week. She said that it helped her heal from many painful experiences in her past. I'd been having a rough time for many years dealing with depression and unhealed childhood trauma, so I decided to give it a try. I certainly did not believe anything would come of it, and I just wanted to make her happy, to be honest. We got there, and the people who seemed like normal members of a regular run-the-mill church congregation greeted us. There were about 20 people. We listened to a sermon, nothing strange, and then everyone paired off for prayer time. I was paired with this little old lady and a very kind face and soft voice. She said she was going to pray for me, and I was thinking, okay, whatever. She's really sweet and I'll just be nice and let her think she's helping me. I sat down in front of her on one of those cheap metal folding chairs that you find at an AA meeting, and she didn't try to take my hand or touch me, which I appreciated. She began by having me name people in my life who had greatly impacted me, people like my immediate family members. I'm shaking and feeling sick just remembering this. It's very hard to get off my chest. What happened next haunts me to this day. She started to pray for deliverance from any negative ties or curses that had been passed to me. Inadvertently, of course, through my family members, her voice, so kind and soft, was nevertheless demanding, like she wasn't going to take crap from these evil forces, and they had to do what she said. I didn't feel anything at first, and didn't expect to, so things were going exactly as I'd imagined. Then she got to my grandma, who had recently passed. As she prayed, my eyelids began to blink rapidly without my control. Okay, that was weird, I thought, but nothing too creepy. Maybe it was just a muscle or twitch. Then she prays about my father. My father suffers deep depression, which I have inherited from him, and as she prays I began to sob uncontrollably. There was no emotion attached, and I was just doing the act of crying loudly and bitterly, but feel nothing and have no control over the tears. I was just sort of crying like you do when you're absolutely broken-hearted. When my fit of sobbing was over, she said, "Sometimes demons come out through tears." This was pretty scary, but was worlds away from the sort of thing you'd see in The Exorcist. So she carried on. I shrugged it off. I don't remember who she prayed about next, but all I know is the next time she prayed for me, my body seized up and became rigid. I couldn't move, but I was very conscious in my mind and knew that I should be able to move. But it was like something inside me was locking my muscles up. This got worse and more intense, until I was almost falling off the chair. My legs began to shake violently, even throwing one of my shoes off. My body was stiff as a board, and the top of my butt was still sitting in the chair, but the rest of me had slid out of it, creating a triangle of space between my body and the chair. I was seconds from falling out of it, and onto the hard concrete floor. My head was thrown back as horrible groans came out my mouth. Meanwhile, I was totally conscious of everything in my mind and thinking rationally. Only my body was out of control. As she prayed, repeating that demons had to leave in Jesus' name, eventually my body was freed from this strange grip, and I was able to sit up again. I went home dazed, and when I looked in the mirror, my face looked different. It was like I had a light bulb on the inside of my face, where previously there had been a regular face. Now it appeared to be glowing. The glow lasted for about a day, and then the next morning I also noticed a bruise on the back of my head, from where the hair clip had dug into my scalp when my head was pressed back against the folding chair. This is how I know for sure that I had not been in control of my body. I had been in pain and terrified out my mind. I was not able to control any of my movements during that prayer time. I have no history of seizures whatsoever, and nothing even remotely close to that has ever happened to me before or since. Meanwhile, back to the deliverance sermon, during all of this, I could hear my mother-in-law being prayed for behind me. Suddenly, the most evil and vile voice I've ever heard came out of her mouth, cackling like a witch from a scary movie. My mother-in-law is partially deaf, and she was seeking to be healed from this. The demon that spoke out of her mouth said, "La la la, I can't hear you," in this wickedly evil mocking voice. It was the same thing that a little kid does and says when they put their finger on their ear and doesn't want to hear what you're saying. There was also filthy language coming out of her mouth. Words I don't think she's ever said before or since. My mother-in-law later said that this was the demon keeping her from hearing properly, but it was not driven out completely because she still has bad hearing. All I can say about this experience is that it's 100% true. A skeptic, non-religious person like me actually experienced, felt, and heard and saw all of this. Make of that what you will. But I know now that evil is real, and to some degree, lives inside us all. As a teenager, I lived in this old apartment building across the street from a bar. I was hanging out with friends in the basement. No one ever went down there, so we thought we would check it out. It was made up of 4 rooms, one of which was off the side in the front of the building, and sort of small. Inside were old liquor bottles and jars of ravioli from the 30s. At the far end of the room were a bunch of boards stacked against the wall. For some reason, we moved them, and there was a hole big enough for a person to crawl into. Being curious, we got flashlights and crawled through this tunnel. It was dark and damp, and crawling with insects. We could hear cars overhead and realized we were under the damn road. It was maybe 150 feet long, and we came to the end where there was another board, but this time it seemed to be nailed on, and there's no way we could turn around, so we kicked and kicked until it was broken enough to go through. We crawled out. There were 3 of us, by the way, and we were in a dark room. We searched for a light switch, but there wasn't one, so we looked around with our flashlights and saw that we were in another basement. There wasn't a door, and we noticed a small wooden door on the ceiling. We got out, and seemed to what appeared to be in another basement. We went upstairs to find ourselves in the bar across the street from me. The bartender came around yelling at us, the owner as well, and questioned us, and we told her of our venture. We came to find out it was a secret tunnel used during Prohibition times. The bar was originally a speakeasy. Sophomore year of high school, a friend and I thought it would be fun to skip English class and go to the neighbouring town's school. Very rebellious and dumb. When we got there, we were unaware that the school was in lockdown for a random drug test. We walked inside thinking, I bet we'll just blend in and nothing happens. Turns out the principal was standing in the middle of the hallway. When he goes, "Hey, what are you doing in the halls?" My partner in crime ran into a bathroom and I ran to the car. I was sitting there, and suddenly I see my partner running to the car with the principal running after him. He jumped in the car and we sped off, and I noticed that a lot of students in the windows were staring at us like we were the reason for the lockdown, and maybe we brought weapons or drugs to the school or something. The principal was holding on to the back of the car. We got away. However, he caught the license plate from my friend's car, and a few days later we figured out that we got caught on the high school's security cameras. The principal wanted to sue us for trespassing on school property. However, he was too busy coaching the volleyball team to pay attention to the case. My parents were pissed, and I felt very bad about the whole thing, mostly because this was my first time skipping class, and it went absolutely terribly. We once found, in one buddy's vacation home in Maine, a secret passage. There were 10 of us, and the house was like 8,000 square feet. The secret passage started under a sink and a bathroom vanity, and went all the way across the house into a closet-type deal that had a wooden seat/box thing, where you'd push on a random knot in the wood grain and it would undo the latch. If you crawled into the vanity, you could sit up with some room to spare, enough room for 2 people to sit facing each other cross-legged. As you crawled closer to the other end, the wooden box end, you had to army crawl. It was very dark, and it got progressively narrower and was super weird. We jammed everyone in and hotboxed it until we literally couldn't breathe. It could have been a panic room, I suppose, but just connected the two wings of the house. His dad had actually built it and wanted to see how long it would take for his kids to find it. This is a true story. My wife and I will swear to it in front of any person on the planet. We lived in a fairly new, double-wide mobile home that sits on a spot that has never had any house of any kind on it, and is at least half a mile from anywhere any houses have ever sat. So you would not think that it's a likely location for a haunting. However, my wife and I have on this occasion seen some rather strange things here and there, the most of which I will relate to here. One night after an uneventful day, my wife and I retired for the night. We sleep in a large waterbed. Some time had passed and I was unable to sleep. My wife's breathing had become regular and reached a point where I assumed she was asleep. It must be also known that we leave a light on in the bathroom furthest from our bedroom because we normally have children in the house. However, that night, there was no one in the house except for my wife and I. But the light was on as usual, casting a glow through our open bedroom door, which weakly lit it. While lying there, unable to sleep, I became aware of a presence, and suddenly, and silently, a figure moved through our bedroom door and proceeded parallel to our bed. Then, rounding the corner of our bed, took up a fixed position at the foot of our bed. I was aware that this entity was conscious of us and was intently watching us as we lay there. The entity can best be described as something that had the appearance of black smoke or a shadow. However, it was more material than either of these, but less material than a real person. The most odd thing about this was my lack of fear. Although I was actually aware of this being and the fact it was not of this earth as we perceived it, it did not seem to arouse any fear response to me. I would say it aroused a feeling that would fit somewhere between creepy, awed, and curious, especially considering the fact that it was aware of me and I was aware of it. After some time, I almost convinced myself that I was imagining it, but then I became aware of the fact that my wife was no longer breathing like she was asleep, but was breathing almost silently. I then said, "Honey, you awake?" To which she answered, "Yes." Then I said, "Do you see anything?" Expecting her to reply to be, "What do you mean?" But much to my surprise, she said, "You mean the thing standing at the foot of our bed?" At this time, I did become somewhat nervous. We lay there for about 10 minutes, and then it was gone. It just over a period of about 10 seconds became less solid and our perception of it became weaker, until it simply wasn't there anymore. Then it was as if it had never been there at all. Nothing like this has ever happened since, and the only evidence it ever existed are mine and my wife's memories of it. I went to boarding school, so there are a number of creepy things I heard about at the school. Normally it's stuff like kids would play Ouija board at the school and would get a phone call from the leader of a local Wiccan community to stop, but sometimes it was a lot stranger. First off, the junior and senior boys' dorm is called the upper school, and in the early part of the 20th century, a student decided to take their own life in the room there. Since then, the dorm has definitely been haunted. There's actually a challenge to stay in the upper school alone for a whole night, in the room where he took his life. In any case, a number of strange things have happened. I know a number of people who've lived in that room who've said they've woken up in the middle of the night, usually at 3 a.m., completely conscious but unable to move. They've all described it as if someone were laying on top of you. Many of you might say sleep paralysis, and who knows, it might just be that. There's only one person I know of, though, who's attempted to stay in the upper school alone. She went to bed as normal until suddenly waking up at 3 a.m. to hear a door open and close, and the pitter-patter of footsteps down the hall. Thinking someone was playing a prank on her, She opened the door and looked out into the hall. Of course, no one was there, so she went back to sleep. Later, she again woke, with the distinct feeling that someone was watching her. She heard the door open and the footsteps in the hall. This time, she went out into the hall. When she got outside the room, the door slammed shut behind her, and absolutely terrified, she booked it out. When her and a faculty member went back the next day, they couldn't open the door because all the furniture had been pushed against the door. This story happened to me when I was 11, attending a Christian summer camp. It was night time, and one of the counselors decided it would be the perfect time to play capture the flag. I was set up as the goalie. I did manage to tag out some of the other teams as they were attempting to steal our flag. After a while though, no one was showing up to steal my team's flag, and I was starting to get bored. I started pacing around the goal, keeping a close eye on it, and that's when I saw something. It didn't move like an animal, and didn't seem to have a solid form. I can tell you that it was grey, and like smoke had come to life and formed eyes, arms, and legs. The thing stood taller than my camp counselor, who was a dude standing at 6'1". Needless to say, my 11-year-old brain said this thing would eat me, and I ran to my counselor, actually bawling my eyes out. We lost the game because of this, and the counselor did report it to the site manager the next day. Now, some people have said that it was everything from an owl to a bear to a raccoon and even a bobcat. I've actually worked with owls since then, so I know it wasn't that. I grew up around raccoons, and bears don't move like this thing was moving. Bobcats, well, it was way too tall to be one. I have in fact educated myself on all sorts of animals since, just because of this experience, even debunked a whole load of paranormal activity just from doing this kind of research. And yet, I've never come across anything that would debunk what I saw that night. When I was younger, I used to get sick a lot. Strep throat and ear infections often bring about very high fevers, and they lend themselves to hallucinations. My mother was no stranger to me spinning wild fantasies while lost in these dark reveries. I once told her I ate glass and was absolutely convinced that it was true. So much my mother started to believe me. I was around 11 or 12 on vacation with my family in Hawaii. Naturally, because I'm always the party downer, I developed a terrible ear infection complete with a dangerously high fever. Hallucinations struck at about midnight when I woke up from pain in the ear. I was sleeping on a convertible couch in the front area of this little grass house and saw through the sliding glass door an elderly woman rocking in a chair on the porch. She was shrouded in a dark cloak so that I couldn't see any of her features, but I still knew it was an elderly woman. She slowly stopped rocking and turned to face me directly, and then reached a skeletal hand up to lower the hood of her robes. As the moonlight revealed her features to me, the idea of an elderly visage melted into a bare bone of a skull. Her eye sockets were empty, but I still knew that she was staring at me. I'm not sure how a skull grins, but at that moment she did just that. Then she looked up, collected her scythe, and walked off the porch. I looked out the living room window that my bed was situated under to watch her stand a little ways away, and watch the process of people make their way down the beach. As the party of people drew closer, I saw they were carrying a casket. A little boy was trailing behind the procession looking blue. The casket was set beneath my window by the group of people, and the lid was opened to reveal the same little boy that I'd seen. He was following his own funeral. It was in that fever-riddled moment that I understood I was going to die someday. Thinking about what I saw that night still leaves me with a ball of fear spinning wildly in my abdomen. 17 years later, that memory turned me right back into a terrified little girl. I was a tutor for an elementary school, where I would pull out advanced reads and conduct a book club sort of thing to encourage kiddos that were ahead of their classmates to still find interests in reading. This was around the time when school shootings were getting really rampant in the US a couple of years back. So I'm there alone with 5 third graders joking around and having book club in the empty classroom I was allowed to use, when all of a sudden an alarm goes off and an announcement is made that there is an active shooter on campus and that we must lock our doors and conduct active shooter protocols. I lose my mind. I usher the students into a little coat closet out of the view of the door, lock the door and flick off the lights. To make it worse, me being a stupid college student at the time, I never had my phone charged. I send as many texts to loved ones as I can, trying to not alarm them, but letting them know I love them, and something is happening at work before my phone dies. The students are also afraid, and about 30 minutes pass, and I hear footsteps outside of the door, and quite literally stop breathing, but they go past. I don't hear any shot or anything. Another half hour passes and I realize I should call the front office to see if they have any updates. My brain goes stupid during emergencies apparently, and I forgot that classrooms have built-in phones during my panic. They answer like nothing's wrong, and I say something like, "Hi, I'm a tutor here, and I've 5 students with me in room Y. Is it safe to come out? Are the police here?" The woman doesn't answer for a little, and as dead ass says, "Oh, we didn't make an all clear announcement? The drill is over." I was so close to tears I just hung up. Then an announcement was made that the drill is over. Nobody thought it would be important to let an outside school contractor know about a drill that very well could have been real. I swear I could have wet myself. As a kid growing up, I lived in a small town in western New York about an hour south of Rochester. Town name Naples. A friend and I were exploring his basement and we found a boarded up tunnel. Looked like a boarded up window. There was a cord of wood stacked in front of it. We finally got the boards off and discovered a hole that went about 30 feet under the house towards the road's main street. We asked his parents what it was, and they told us it was a link to the Underground Railroad that slaves used to escape to the north. Actually to Buffalo and then across to the Canadian border. We did some research at the town library, and from everything we could find it appeared to be true. I guess there was once a network of tunnels under the town, and this house was on top of one of those pathways. For context, my brother has always said something follows him. Jay was diagnosed with schizophrenia and low bipolar disorder. He has heavy drinking and drug habits, the worst luck you've ever seen, and extremely accident-prone to injury. This night is the scariest encounter with Jay's demons. The night is cold, and my friend Becky and I decide to smoke pot for the first time. We made a fire by the river. It began to sprinkle a little, but there's so many trees by the river that we really never felt anything from the natural tree canopy. It had only been about 30 minutes, and we decided to make a fire. The night so far was proving to be pretty fun. That's until it happened. We hear a strange noise, then a loud cracking, almost like a tree falling over and snapping every branch. All 3 of our heads dart to the right, as we see a 12-inch thick branch take on a massive weight as it's rocking from the force. I immediately felt this knot of dread in my stomach. No one spoke, just the noises from the river and crackling on the fire. The best way I can describe it is a large black void just landed on the branch. No silhouette, no brief glimpse from the light of the fire, just an absolute lack of light crashed through a thick old tree and landed on this branch. I can't tell you why, but in my head, I knew that it was looking at us and feared that if we moved, we'd be dead. 10 minutes must have flown by, and it felt like hours, and I tried to break the silence, and my brother grabs my arm slowly and says, "Shut up," quickly and quietly. Fear has gripped my mind, and I can't help but stare back at this thing staring at us, and as quickly as it came, it shot back up through the trees, breaking more branches as it left. Like being freed from its grip, my brother shot out of his chair and starts running back to the house. My friend Becky and I followed quickly. We confirmed all the details with each other and rarely spoke of it. I don't know what it was, and I don't know what it wanted. I just know it's always followed my brother, either messing with him or slamming doors, and it still persists to haunt him to this very day. Anyone with advice? I would greatly appreciate it. I was a teenager and at a weekend camp. We were playing a flashlight tag game and I was running and hiding rather than seeking. I had been sneaking around a lot and bailing into the bush if younger kids came near. It made it more fun if the leaders moved, so the kids had more of a chance. This one time, I was just about caught by a group and jumped into an area of brush. As soon as I landed, I heard someone else shift and heard their breathing. I whispered, "Sorry, I didn't know you were here." They didn't answer. I waited for them for almost a minute in silence, aside from hearing the breathing, while the kids went a different way. I said to them, "We can probably head off now," and started to go. The other person also left, rustling through the brush on the other way without saying a word. So while I don't know what I was hunkered down with, it was bigger than a raccoon and smaller than a fully grown bear. Maybe a baby bear or coyote. No idea, but it was definitely kind of freaky. One night I was going to sleep, and all of a sudden I started to sweat profusely. I tried to get up and turn on the AC, but I could not move from my bed. I was confused a bit and scared, and tried to shout for my sister in the next room over, but I couldn't speak either. At this point is where I saw a dark figure in the corner watching me. It felt like years until the silence broke, and it muttered in a distorted voice, "You're not safe." At this point I could hear my heart pounding like it was in my ear. Next thing I knew, the figure moved across the room to the foot of my bed. It stared into my soul, and then I could move. I was soaked in sweat, and that night I did not sleep. To this day I have never had sleep paralysis after that, and I wonder if I am really safe. I was attending this boarding school that was over 175 years old. I was entering 6th grade and moving into the dormitories above the school infirmary. On the first night, when settling in, I was by my desk and looked out the window to see this really young boy, pale and glowing. What was strange was that he had a cape tied to his neck, slick hair with a short sleeve button-up shirt, shorts and bowling shoes. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me since he wasn't too far from the streetlight. As I'm looking at him, he looks up at me, waves and walks away while vanishing into the night. I told my roommates and they laugh at me. Fast forward in time, I'm now in the 9th grade and was going to this alumni event where we talk to alumni and look at memorabilia. I'm going through old Lettermans, baseball leagues and other things on display when I come across an old picture of the same young boy with a friend. I could recognize him immediately because he looked exactly like the same ghost that I saw a few years back. The picture was taken during Halloween, which explains the cape. I was so shaken up about it, I had to leave the event for a moment. According to one alumni, the little boy died in a flu outbreak in the infirmary that killed a lot of students in the early 1900s. His friend, also in the photo, survived, graduated, and donated the photo along with other tokens to the collection. I've heard many ghost stories about spirits who pass through and haunt the old dorms. Also, many of the buildings are basically relics, so I'm surprised that I didn't see more ghosts on campus. In my city, our big central library resides in a once huge mansion. When I was a kid, perhaps 9, I was there for a field trip when I noticed scratch marks on the wood floor swinging out of an arc from the wall. The wall itself was a bunch of built-in bookshelves, and deduced there may be a secret room there. I asked the librarian giving us the tour, and she revealed that there was a secret door there, which she opened for us by pulling a book out of one of the shelves. It was like something you see in a movie. It made me think of Clue, which was one of my favourite movies at the time. It led to a small display room where they put a bunch of random pieces of art and sculpture. Apparently there were a bunch of secret doors/rooms in the library too, but I never returned to have a look through them, though it would have been cool to do. Well, I was in a room in my house at night, and I had the lights out and a candle lit on a table roughly in the middle of the room. The candlelight was causing all the normal things in the room to cast shadows. However, on one wall, there wasn't anything but a box against it. And I might also add, there was nothing between the candle and that wall but the box. So on that wall was a box up against it, and the box's shadow. Well, at some point I looked up, and there was a shadow of a man sitting on the box, but there was no one else in the room but me, and it wasn't my shadow. The shadow of the man was very clear. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. I even looked away several times, and when I would look back it was still there. It was motionless. It stayed for several minutes, and I was pretty much frozen in shock and fear. Eventually I looked over, and it was gone. Just the box and its shadow remaining. I'd like to add I was an extreme skeptic. I pretty much didn't trust anybody's account of the paranormal. I did not believe in ghosts nor shadow people, but since the incidents, things have changed. But for me, nothing short of seeing something for myself was going to make me a believer, and I never expected it to happen. Now I know that for a fact these things exist, but these things, I mean like the things that I saw, I have no explanation for. I sat next to a great guy in one of my classes in high school, Alexander, who was some kind of inter-district transfer after the year started. We had a ton in common and got on eerily well. Our last conversation was a debate on who or what Mr. Beam really is. I'm in the he's an alien camp, and Alexander was convinced he was an angel. We went back and forth on the pros and cons for both. What makes an alien, what makes an angel, and what would make them both behave like that? We couldn't really dissuade each other nor convince each other either way. It was one of the most intelligent debates about a frivolous topic I've ever had. It was fun. I was smitten, and looked forward to seeing him again the next day. He absolutely disappeared. He wasn't there the next day. His seat was empty for the next few days, and I asked my teacher if they knew anything or if he was okay. They didn't know who I was talking about. They had a look at their past roll sheets to find his name and noticed that he wasn't on for the last few days' sheets. They would not give me his last name because he was a recent transfer and he wasn't in the school directory. I went to the office out of concern, and all of this was far too weird. Again, they looked him up. Could barely find him. Would not give me his last name or any information. I asked them to pass on my number and name, and they had no address or phone number to be able to do that. It's like he never existed, except as a name on 1 or 2 pieces of paper. I'm sure there's a perfectly normal explanation, but it's so strange, and with the subject of our last debate in my mind, I always have this weird feeling that there was more to it. But that's impossible, right?
It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I had just gotten home from school. I was so exhausted that I threw my bag aside and plopped into bed. As I drifted off to sleep, it didn't take long for it to become a lucid dream. In the dream, I decided to go for a walk, so it turned into the dreamscape of a mall. The mall would be like the ones that is partially outside. I always loved the holidays, so it was quite festive once I walked in. I turned a corner in the mall and noticed everyone was gone. The mall was empty. As I reached the center of the mall where the Christmas tree was, I noticed a tall figure in the overcoat standing behind the tree as if spying on me. Due to the lighting, I couldn't see his face, but it did seem strange. Right as I focused on him, people started pouring from different stores and other areas as if carrying on about their day. However, one thing was different about them. They were all giving me threatening looks, as if I was the one who didn't belong in my dream. This put me on edge, and I decided to make an exit at the door that led to the street. I looked to the left and to the right, and as I am on the long street in the city, all that can be seen in both directions is streetlights and kids trick-or-treating. It was at this time I figured I would pick a random group of kids and tag along with them. They took me to a haunted house. When we got there, we were faced with a large metal door that opened and closed by itself. It would count a certain number of people and let them in accordingly. I was lucky enough to be the odd number, so the kids left through the door, and then I had to wait for it to reopen alone. As it opened, I walked out, and the children were gone. Even if they were eager to go somewhere, I knew they couldn't have left me that fast. I looked left and right and the streets were empty. I looked to the right and thought it was empty too, until I saw him, the man in the overcoat, and the uneasy feeling began to set in again, as he began to slowly follow me. Growing nervous, I created an alley that led to a grocery store. It was a sudden shift compared to my normal created door that opens elsewhere, but I managed it by closing the alley behind me. I began walking down the aisles when something told me to turn around. That's when I saw him again. As I looked at him, the fluorescent bulbs didn't show every detail, but they showed enough. The man's skin was a light grey, as if he were dead. I could see his skin through the trench coat, hugging his ribs and sternum. I could not see his eyes for some reason, but what I did notice was a horrible, elongated grin stretched across his face like the Jack Nicholson Joker. I was so distracted by that grin that I didn't notice he had started approaching me until he was almost in the aisle. In a panic, I began morphing aisles together, leaving a big space enough only so that I could shimmy through. I felt relief. I knew he wouldn't be able to make it through the crevice. As I turned around, I noticed the aisles were being moved back into position as he casually walked towards me. I couldn't believe it. He was following me in my dream and there was nothing I could do. I was trying to calm myself down now, and I thought I needed to wake myself up. I shut my eyes and awoke in my bed. I could tell by the sunlight from the window that I had only slept perhaps an hour or two. The sunlight caused me to squint and blink. But suddenly I was back in the dream, seeing the man was still approaching. I shut my eyes tighter this time and awoke again. That's when I noticed the closet was ajar. I blink again and I'm back. Once more I shut my eyes tighter than I've ever have before and awake. Now I'm in bed, closet wide open. The blanket was very old and had patches that were transparent, even though it was covering my head, and I watched through the material as the black man from my dream emerged from the closet, this time without his trench coat, and I could see the full extent of his torso excluding his face. I was surprised this man was not dust from the look of his exterior. He came out and just stood at the foot of my bed, standing there, and I dared not move at this point, despite the fact I was concealed under the blanket. He began to bend over. I wasn't entirely concerned because even though he was tall, I knew his face couldn't reach me. But then his torso began to stretch out towards me far enough for his mouth to be able to be right where the patch of material lay. I saw his mouth through the covers and nothing else. I had a horrible feeling come over me, telling me whatever I do to not look into his eyes. His mouth began to move slowly, as I heard multiple whispers that I could not make out. Before I could react though, he bent back into shape and returned to the closet. After I woke up, I stared at the closet for what seemed like hours. I've never been able to explain what happened to me that day, and have not been able to lucid dream since. I would like to, but I feel like I need to be prepared to deal with this entity again, in case, if I do it, he will return. Because I don't know how he leaked from my dreams into reality.
To preface this, I'd like to say that my school is regularly featured on both national and local news and internet for the amount of ridiculous stuff that happens here. Riot, food fights, incidents where the girls' nude pictures get spread, Cypress Bay, anyone? And finally, a full-on bomb threat. My school has a fairly large campus, one large 2-story building comprising the entire arts, science and sports departments, the lunchroom and administration offices. Another 2 large-story buildings that house the media center and hundreds of classrooms, followed by a third 3-story building and 50 portables. This makes covering all school grounds time-consuming and very dangerous. So when there was a bomb threat in my freshman year, we were locked down for over 4 hours while the SWAT team scoured the building accompanied by police dogs and armed with M4s and 12-gauge shotguns. We were told to sit against the wall on which the door was because there was also a report of a possible gunman. I was honestly terrified. I saw the police and SWAT team run through the bathrooms in front of our class, and thoughts of running off campus into my house were inundating me. I lived in the neighborhood across the street, a 60-second dash that could get me to safety. In the end, they found out it was a fluke, and it was all staged by one kid that faked a bomb threat to avoid taking a test. Idiot didn't even get suspended.
The following story takes place in Madison, Wisconsin. I met a college girl that was living in a defunct frat house. They had lost their charter for reasons I didn't know at first. We fell for each other and I moved in with her. It was a great apartment complex with pool tables and giant showers. One night when we were drunk, she took me to a room that was empty. It had 2 bunk beds, and above one bed was a secret door/hatch. It led to an upstairs room where most of the hazing took place. The story goes that one night during a party, in the dead of winter, a girl was gang raped by some of the frat boys, and they just left her up there in the cold, and she ended up dying from freezing to death. One of the frat boys was so distraught by the incident that he went up there one day and painted her picture on the wall, then hung himself. While we were up there, I could swear that the eyes on the picture would follow you around the room, and some people swore that they would hear crying coming from upstairs. As you can imagine, I never ventured up there again.
This incident happened about 4 years ago when I was 16. It was the middle of the night, and I was asleep and not alone. I had my sister sleeping in the same room. All of a sudden, I was awoken by something grabbing my thigh, and I sat up immediately. All I could see is a hand grabbing me tightly, and a figure covered in my blanket. I tried screaming, but I was aware my voice wasn't coming out at all. I tried waking up my sister, but couldn't even reach her. One thing I was wondering the whole time was if it was real or just a dream. So I started to notice every small detail I usually don't remember about my room. Like how I placed my pens that night on my table, or how I threw my pile of clothes on a chair, and I started to pray to Humamu, as I'm Hindu, and I had a bright light behind me, and I could see some shadows projecting on my wall, and then the figure, hidden in my blankets, was sucked down, and I passed out. I woke up immediately and looked around, and everything seemed just the way I remembered. 2 days passed, and I had the biggest bruise on that same thigh, and as days passed, when it was starting to fade, the bruise took a shape of a hand with long fingers. I always thought it was a very creepy experience. My former comprehensive school has seen its fair share of paranormal activity. Caretakers, teachers, and students can tell you a ghost story about it, and you know for certain they're not lying. Enter my English teacher. He was my teacher for the first 3 months of Year 7, before he went to Romania. He had a really long name. We just called him Ryan. He was a funny guy, and before he left in December of 2015, he shared with us a really creepy story. Having been built on a graveyard, the school's caretakers have certainly seen some rather supernatural occurrences. Once the night has the area blanketed in darkness, and it definitely takes control here.
On this occasion, the caretakers had to go into the basement, I can't remember exactly what for, when they came across a horrific sight. All that I do know is that there was a photo involving some mangled-like feet. My teacher was going to jump scare the class one day by doing a rah sound effect while showing the picture, and since it was only the good students in the class, I was the only person who got the jump scare warning. I'm not sure if he knew I was into Five Nights at Freddy's at the time, as well as creepypastas and stuff, but anyway. So chaos ensued after the jump scare, and to quote Cillian Murphy's Scarecrow, they scream and they cry. Now, I need to mention that my old school opened in 1966 during the Cold War era. The graveyard nearby dates back to the mid-19th century, around 1861, so there is an 105-year gap. According to my science teacher in Year 8, given how poor the town where the comprehensive school was back then and now, the majority of the graves were made of sandstone, so you can imagine how many graves have been built over, and perhaps the restless souls those graves belong to. And then there's the story that Courtney shared with me. One of the school's bathrooms, the actual clean one near the assembly hall, is allegedly the place with the highest rates of paranormal activity in the school. I'd never had any issues in there. Perhaps if they were true, spirits took pity on me, as all the other toilets had been vandalized by the lowest of the low, thus leaving me alone to do the necessary business and wash my hands. But I was never in there for more than 5 minutes, so I guess that's another reason why perhaps I never experienced anything in there. But Courtney's story goes that she and a few other girls were getting changed in the bathroom for drama. I don't recall all the details, but what I do recall is that they were the only ones in the bathroom when something happened to make their costumes, or at least this girl's, called Karina, mysteriously go into the toilet bowl. Suffice to say, they were spooked upon seeing their costume in there. Courtney believes it was a ghost. I personally, as I wasn't there, don't know what to make of it. Perhaps someone managed to pull a prank for giggles. But this wasn't the only time that a ghost was allegedly spotted. She apparently saw one near the toilets that was once the maths block turned English writing block. Like I said earlier, this school has history, being old and with the graveyard beneath it. So who knows if there are specters roaming around still. I used to work a graveyard shift, and before I would get ready for work, I would take a quick hour or two nap. On this particular day, I had a tough time falling asleep, but once I did, I was immediately transported into a dream. During this whole dream, imagine me going through the whole thing with a feeling of utter and complete dread, just a feeling of knowing that I was not supposed to be doing this, or see this place at all. For context, I'm a girl who was 19 at the time, but in the dream I was a boy of around the age of 10, and I was with 4 other boys. One was younger, and my brother, who was about 6, and 3 others were my friends around my age. It was late summer, and about 6 at night. It was just starting to get dark out, and we were walking through this forested area, one that seemed to be right outside a new housing development. I remember hearing a train nearby, and 2 of the older boys who were leading the way were talking about a tunnel that they had found the day before. My little brother and I asked questions while the 3rd boy remained quiet, while we followed the elder 2. We then came to what I can only describe as a concrete slab, with what looked like a sewage drain in the center. But there was no smell of sewage, and the surrounding area was cleared out, trees and bushes cut down and removed. We climbed down into the tunnel, and were brought into a concrete room with a large drain about 3 feet in diameter, in the center of the floor, and a clean metal grate covering it. It was too dark to see if there was anything in there, but I got the feeling that it had to be water. 2 of the walls parallel to one another were blank, while the other 2 had tunnels in them, again about 3 feet in diameter. It was around the same height and size off the ground, and the walls were perfect angles and had no signs of aging, and the grates and floor, save for a few pine needles, were kicked in while climbing down, and spotless. One of the tunnels on the wall had a grate on it, while the other was open. The 2 older boys climbed up and began examining something with a flashlight. It was a rock or gem of some sort. One of them told me to light the lantern we had bought, and I lit it, and handed it to the quiet friend while I helped my brother climb into the open space. Suddenly we heard a humming, like machinery starting up coming from the open tunnel. The two boys got excited and started to head down the tunnel. My little brother followed, and I tried to get them to slow down. I glanced at my friend, and he shrugged, handed me the lantern, and hopped up into the tunnel after them. I looked up out of the drain one last time with the feeling of knowing that I would never see the sky again. My knowledge was confirmed when the lid to the drain above me slammed down, next to the loud clang of heavy metal on metal, when I heard the horrified screams of my friends. And then I wake up sobbing. I still for the life of me cannot figure out who the hell I was or where I was. I don't know any names of the people I was with or what happened to us after I woke, but I remember every other detail. Every once in a while, I will try to do some Google searches to see if I can find anything about 5 boys going missing in a forest, and nothing ever comes up. The dream was so vivid, so real, that I can't help but feel that maybe I was somehow projecting into some little boy's mind and got to watch as he and his friends found something they shouldn't and perished because of it. It creeps me out to this day, and you can't imagine just how it itches in my mind. Any thoughts and ideas would be tremendously appreciated.
I moved into a house with my friend. It was an old Victorian house complete with a basement. We went down and put some furniture there and checked it out. 2 carpeted rooms with old junk in it, and then some bricks on the floor from the wall. We look at the wall and there's a hole in there, just big enough for me to fit through at a squeeze. A dirt slope down into a huge high-ceilinged room, complete with a shelf and a sleeping bag and a duvet on. The room had been soundproofed, had electricity and water in it, and a huge closed-off fireplace, floor to ceiling. The only way in and out of the room was the hole I crawled through. Didn't freak me out too much. I figured I was underneath next door's house, but the duvet bothered me. I lived there for years with no problems. I wonder if someone had been living there. We went to a school located on a main street in Sydney. One day there was a bank robbery further down the street. Masked men, armed police, the whole 9 yards. During this time, a few students decided they were going to sneak off and have a quick ciggy down the back oval. This oval linked the main road to the back streets. Meanwhile, back in the main street, the police were chasing the robbers down it, who promptly ran through the school. By this time, we were already in lockdown. The smokers and robbers ran through the oval and into the back street. The police had lost them at the time and stood on the back over trying to work out where they could have gone. One of the officers heard sounds coming from the bushes, and all 20 armed police officers raised their guns and called for them to come out. 2 terrified 15-year-olds came out of the bushes to see 20 armed police officers aiming their guns at them. The robbers were eventually caught, I believe, and the 2 kids never smoked again.
Going through the education system in England is a box of chocolates in terms of what will happen. You never know truly what you will get. Enter yours truly. I'm a female, white, with brown curly hair and blue eyes, standing at about 5'6" and weighing about 120 pounds or 54 kilos. Your average girl, who did try to be a good person in school but was surrounded by lowlives. By all means, I was unattractive. At least back then I was. No one wants a nerdy girl who barely has the right physical qualities society wants. Not that I could care given the Discrimination Act against people with mental disabilities, as I have autism, though no one will notice, as I'm perfectly normal in public. At the vomit pile I will call my comprehensive school, where do I begin? Their motto? High expectations. Yet they failed to meet my expectations of them. It was horrifying, as you're about to find out. Aside from the overbearing, unreasonable rules, low-quality uniform, over-vandalized toilets, as well as soulless interior, Barely anything happened at this putrid toilet of a school. Occasionally a fight would break out during break, but those lasted a millisecond before the fight police, aka staff on duty, diffused any and all situations. We did have a few good teachers, like my physics teacher, who I will talk about later, as well as some downright horrible ones. Like my former maths teacher, who I hope is dead, but sometimes the nicest of all aren't as pleasant as they portray themselves to be. Enter Christopher. At a glance he seemed like a relatively pleasant guy, 6'4", average build, who wore a dark red jumper and was a brilliant teacher. At least, that's what we saw. He taught 2 subjects, geography and philosophy and ethics. I was one of his students for the latter in Year 9. The topic was introduced to my school in 2017 and went over matters including Dante, the existence of aliens, various religions, if the afterlife exists, and the paranormal. What I forgot to mention earlier is that my school was built on a graveyard. This graveyard is where the smokers would convene together to smoke their lungs away. Some had the balls to do it on school grounds, but were often caught by teachers. Since the school was built on this graveyard, it's widely believed to be haunted, and a good friend of mine, Courtney, had actually seen some ghosts. I hadn't seen any though, and I do believe in them. Anyway, in Year 11, 2019, I was 16. We had a day called Careers Day, in which we went over our potential future careers. While the younger year groups did a sponsored walk, I was 2 months into grieving my first rabbit that had passed away in August 2019, and it didn't help that I had to go to school. So a day away from the annoying younger year group was most appreciated. Christopher was meant to be my tutor for the day, but he didn't show up, and instead, this lady tutored us. Unbeknownst to us, Christopher had been arrested. At the time, his absence didn't seem anything out of the ordinary, and we dismissed it as nothing more than a minor illness, but how wrong we were. Cut to 3 months later, Friday, 17th of January 2020. Sitting down by the fences in the yard, myself and some other observant students noticed teachers leaving the assembly hall, some looking rather distraught. Something was off. I knew it. Something had happened, and it would be a matter of time before the students learned what it was. I went to sit outside my physics classroom, as that was in a quieter area of the science block, and had my last lesson for the day, which was probably the best part of school. Sitting down, I began to wonder, what was going on with the teachers? Had another teacher died? Then I remembered Christopher had been absent for 3 months. Must have been about him. Rumors spread faster than Sonic the Hedgehog amongst the school. It didn't take much detective work for our students to figure out the assembly was about him. Having lost my rabbit 5 months prior, and a teacher having taken her own life before this, I began to stress out, panicking, as I personally thought he was deceased. Someone in my classes suspected that Christopher had depression, while others figured he quit. There were other ideas, plus the idea he could be dead. None of us suspected the truth. While the lesson continued, my autism got the better of me, with the anxiety to know what was going on. The head teacher stonewalled us by disallowing teachers from telling us, and I was unable to prepare myself for what was to be told in the assembly, and unable to plan out an appropriate response. Later on, our teacher left the classroom while the majority of people chatted. I got on quietly with the work when out of the blue he returned, told everyone to get down, before making us leave and walk to the hall. I asked the librarian if this was a repeat of what happened with the previous teacher, and they just gave a straight no. This didn't help. My anxiety was really taking a toll. As we entered the hall, our head teacher, Helen, began to tell us what was going on. She disclosed that in his private life, Christopher had committed sexual assaults and appeared in court that day, and was remanded in custody and back in jail until further notice. I thought Helen said that he had committed assaults toward people, including children, but she actually said committed assaults involving children. Both crimes are absolutely disgusting. Upon hearing the news, my face was that of a gorgon's, emotions concealed and stoic. I don't know how I could stay stoic while Helen was describing what had happened. We had been fooled and betrayed. A person who had a duty to look after and protect and educate children had been exploiting that privilege. As the assembly drew to a close, our head teacher told us to not speak with news personnel about the matter and to ignore them. That was immediately quite sketchy. People should be able to speak up, especially if they've been victims, because who knows, maybe Christopher did exploit someone in our school specifically. Leaving the hall, I saw two of my friends both crying. I gave them a big hug. I called my mum and told her what happened, and took note of how others around me discussed the matter. Most were talking with friends, ordinary stuff. Some were joking around, slanging about, and I heard one boy shouting, "Sirs and nonce," at least twice. I wished that they would end their twisted jokes that the lowlife scum made. That wasn't the case. They continued on with their cheap, twisted jokes. A few days later, during chemistry, one of my friends showed me a news article that Christopher had confessed to 8 assaults, including 2 rapes, and was sentenced to 10 years behind bars on February 3rd. Now for the creepy part. After Christopher had been sentenced, since school had not updated us after we went to court, I looked at the news article regarding what he'd done. According to the news, Christopher had raped a young boy aged 13 to 14, so around year 9, not much younger than me. Using messaging apps like WhatsApp and Kik, he had groomed the boy while messaging another paedophile from a local area near him. Then the boy was raped to the point of developing a phobia of being home alone in case he was tracked down and violated, trapped like a hunted animal. The news mentioned at least 44 pictures and 47 indecent videos of the child, making a total of 91 on his computer. Christopher had no emotion on his face throughout the trial. He blamed the heavy workload for what he did, and I think it was rather selfish of him to say that. I was one of his best students alongside some others who were decent and produced outstanding work. I was the nicest one, but he won't remember, because he was selfish enough to blame his students and colleagues for what he did. Not to mention that his class had officially been screwed over, because having substitutes the rest of the time really does deteriorate your education. But when you think about it, had Christopher not been arrested, what would he have done? Would he have targeted other children? Could he have planned to harm those at school, turning them into his slaves at his mercy? It's horrifying to think about, especially when it hit it so well. I no longer attend that school. It was never pleasant there at all.
This story is what I usually call the scariest day of my life. I was having a sleepover at one of my friends' houses. There were 3 of us, and for some reason we began telling scary stories earlier that day. We decided to play Charlie Charlie, which is a classic ghost game to keep the scary mood up. However, something strange began to occur. It actually worked, and we began talking with a spirit called Charlie. Now at first we didn't mind, and my friends didn't believe it, but one of my friends called Bob decided to make fun of the spirit, which is something you should never do. I then asked the spirit if it was angry, and it said yes. Directly after this there was an earthquake. Now earthquakes where I live are so incredibly rare that there have only been about 3 in the past 20 years in this area of my country combined. So the fact that this earthquake happened at the exact moment could be coincidental, but mathematically, it's not likely. After this, the scary stuff began to happen. First of all, I saw a shadow creature standing behind us. Next, my friend freaked out because they saw something they described as a white, hairless creature with black eyes and a large mouth. We decided to hide in our room and lock the door, but then we heard something breathing under the bed. Then we heard scratching from under there. The house is my second friend, Nathan's. Nathan said the sound didn't sound natural, like it couldn't have been the wind or anything. We got freaked and all had to go onto the top bunk, and it was very uncomfortable. But in the end, it wasn't even the end of it. In the morning, I saw things like moving shadows without people, my shadow becoming its own being and walking away, and my friend claims they saw a massive 2-headed dog and a slender man-like creature. But here's the thing. We're in the middle of nowhere. We were too young to drink and smoke, and didn't get high or anything. I don't know what happened that day, but both of my friends clearly remember everything that happened, and we all share the exact same wild story every time we bring it up.
Before I moved to the States, I was about 12, and I was having a sleepover with one of my friends. At the time it happened, my parents were getting us something to eat, and my brother was over at his friend's house. We were in the living room talking about close to being dark, when we felt like we were floating, but we weren't. But it felt like we were. Then all of a sudden we heard figures brushing on the window blinds. The windows, where it happened, were across from us, and we actually saw the blinds move a little bit. We went into my room and waited for my parents, but it didn't stop. That night my friend woke up all of a sudden, and she said she felt like someone was staring at her. She said that she saw this tall dark figure by my door, which was closed, but it was now open. She also saw a smaller dark figure standing by me. It was staring at my TV. When she told me this next morning, I didn't want to believe it, and told her it could have just been a dream. But she gave me a look which was pure fear, and that's rare of her, since she doesn't get scared often. I have to admit that it put me on edge, and that I was afraid of being in my own room at night. But when nothing else happened, I just brushed it off. I still wonder if she really saw something, or if it was just, sleep paralysis.
I managed a building in Portland, and in the basement there was a side hallway, and down this dark and old side hallway there were little rooms that had been a part of a flop house that was in there. In the back of one of these rooms, boarded up, we found an entire bathroom that was functional. It was old as hell, and we had to do a little work on it, but it ended up being really useful, and found another small room behind a wall near the coal chute that had a bunch of really old barrels and a pike. Pretty cruel stuff, but definitely creepy as hell when you're doing it. In the summer of 2002, when I was 12, I went to the California School for the Blind for a tech training camp. There were 12 of us, 6 girls and 6 boys. The boys had started spreading scary ghost stories around school. What they didn't know was that some of the stories were actually true. On the first night, I was telling my roommate the story of the booms. Booms are toilet bowl-shaped bouncing creatures that bring knickknacks to children. The moment I described the sound they made, 3 loud booms came from the wall of the room beside ours, and I asked the girls in that room if they'd heard it, and they said no. The second night, I got up to go to the room attached to the shared bathroom. That's where I saw it. It was round like a ball, with a half horn on its head and glowing red eyes. I don't remember the next part, but I was filled in later. I apparently ran out the room screaming that there was something in our bathroom. Oddly, I remember leaving the room prior to seeing the thing to tell someone that there was peeling paint on a wall. My roommate told me she'd heard speaking in male voices, and also many rude words. She also said that she heard chains rattling outside and saw the glow of eyes. 4 years later, I started attending the school there. The staff members from that night still worked there, and her response when we met is that she remembered me that night. She then told me that she saw it, and she and other students and staff had heard similar stuff. Other friends told me that they had seen and heard things. Some of the events were freezing cups of water, glowing toys, drums, flutes, and orbs. I believe that in the children's dorm and health center are the 2 most haunted areas, and it's said that the school was built on an Indian burial ground.
I work for a place that sometimes asks me to fly down to Laredo, Texas for some work assignments. I love to travel, so I always agree to go. The company always books me a room at La Posada Hotel, a very old and famous hotel. I've stayed here countless times and I've never had any issue or problems, and for the most part my stays at this hotel are always uneventful. However, one night I experienced something that I will never forget, and I sometimes think about every now and then. It was after a long day at work. I got back to my hotel room and quickly fell asleep. Nothing strange, but in the middle of the night I started to have a very disturbing dream. In this dream I was standing in a room, and someone's arms were wrapped around my chest area. I didn't know whose arms were wrapped around me at first, nor did I really care, but what got my attention quickly was that this individual was starting to essentially dry hump me from behind. This is one of the reasons I've never told anyone this. When the individual started to essentially assault me from behind, I immediately turned around to see who was there and yell at them to stop. To my dismay, the person I saw in my dream was my younger brother. I'm a guy, by the way, and was obviously shocked and sickened to see this, so I immediately woke up. When I did, I would find myself lying on my stomach in bed, with my face looking towards the nightstand. The first thing I saw was the alarm clock, 3:08 a.m. I then noticed that I was in a state of sleep paralysis. I couldn't move my body at all, and I could move my eyes. The best way to describe this state of sleep paralysis was that it felt like there was a heavy blanket of gravity keeping me down and motionless. All I could see were the bright red numbers of the alarm clock as the room was pitch dark. Then I realized something chilling. The humping sensation I had originally felt in my dream, and what was the cause of me to wake up, did not stop. It was an aggressive feeling, and I just felt my backside being pushed down. I don't know why, but to be honest, I wasn't as scared as much as I was confused. It was like my mind was still trying to process everything going on. I had just woken up from a dream where my younger brother was assaulting me, and after waking up I found myself in sleep paralysis with the humping sensation persisting. All I remember doing was closing my eyes, opening them again, and hoping it was still possible I was dreaming. But it wouldn't stop. It felt like something was on top of me, preventing me from moving, and that this thing was assaulting me as well. I remember that I then put all of my focus on my hand. All I wanted to do was move it. I felt that if I could move my hand, I would slap out of it. While opening and closing my eyes, I would focus on my hand and do everything possible to move it. And after what felt like an eternity, I was finally able to gain control and move. I opened my eyes and saw that only about a minute had passed on the alarm clock. I sat up on the bed and turned on the lamp on the nightstand. That is when the fear of what had just happened to me hit me. I thought to myself, what the hell was that? I don't remember going back to sleep that night. I stayed in that same room for the rest of the trip, and have since made multiple trips to the same hotel and nothing eventful has happened since. I didn't tell anyone what happened due to the fact I barely believed myself, and it was a bit embarrassing to be honest. I'm someone who tries to look for the logical explanation of things. The logical side of me tells me that it was just a big dream all in my head. However, there is something else that tells me it wasn't. I know what I felt. It felt like something was assaulting me that night. I don't necessarily believe in spirits or entities, but it's an experience like this that causes me to pause and just think a little. I hope you understand why the story is both embarrassing and scary. If I can go out on a limb here and entertain the idea that spirits and entities are real, then could it be that I was essentially assaulted by one of them? What gets me though was that it first started in a dream. I don't understand how it could have been incorporated into it. I feel like that is what happened to me, except it wasn't a sound but a feeling. Could it truly be that I was assaulted by something in the middle of the night, and that it manifested in my dream? I know you won't have the answers, but I would love to hear your listeners' thoughts on this bizarre event.
When I was a senior in high school, I was sitting on my back porch with a friend, drinking and smoking cigarettes, when suddenly she got quiet. After a moment she turned to me and asked, "Where does that window go?" I'd lived in this house for 5 years at this point, and had never noticed an extra window on the back of my house. Amazingly, neither had anyone else in my family. The backyard was pretty overgrown, and we almost never spent any time there. I pretty quickly determined that the window had to be located behind the wall of our hall bathroom shower, but it was locked from the inside and seemed to be nailed shut as well. What could possibly be hidden inside that wall? Why would you seal up a window from the inside but leave it completely accessible from the back of the house? It didn't make sense. This naturally became a topic of intense speculation for me and the friends I had over to drink every time Mum was out of town. There must be a body, or catch of old documents, or pirate gold back there, but alas, we couldn't get inside without breaking the window, and I wasn't willing to vandalize my own home to satisfy my curiosity. 10 years later, the house was in serious need of renovations, to include a complete remodel of the hall bathroom, and I finally got my chance. Time had done nothing but sharpen my curiosity about the mystery sealed wall, and I knocked down the tiles and broke through the drywall. 1,000 possibilities raced through my mind. Jimmy Hoffa could be hidden back there, or an original copy of the Declaration of Independence, or quite possibly the Holy Grail itself. Barely able to contain my excitement, I ripped a huge chunk of the wall with nothing but my gloved hands, finally revealing the long-forgotten window and a bunch of moldy pink insulation. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, kids. I am a teacher and have been teaching English in Texas since 2012. This is my 7th year in the classroom, and I've recently moved up to a new high school in our district. I was and am very excited to begin my new year here, after being in the trenches of middle school classrooms for 6 years. My second year in my first school, I was asked to move classrooms to a room at the end of the hall upstairs, which wasn't a problem per se, as many people moved due to attribution, and schools are always willing to help teachers move classrooms. The school at that time was roughly 20 years old. I took great pleasure in preparing a welcoming environment for students. The walls were covered, which I'm positive was a fire hazard, in amazing posters, engaging student art. I had several lamps as well as fluorescent lights. Every year for Halloween we'd begin to read and analyze Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, which was always a favorite. I took 2 days to read and analyze and read about the poems the students were really receptive to, and enjoyed the spooky atmosphere I created with decoration as we listened to Christopher Lee's and James Earl Jones' version on YouTube. It was a nice way to relax before the holiday. The first year in the new classroom right after Halloween and the Poe analysis, things began happening. The lamps would flicker. There wasn't any perceivable pattern, nothing flew around the room, exploded or fell over. The lamps would just flicker, whether I was in the room by myself or in a conference or anything. Once a week, the lights would flicker on and off. I attributed this to the old wiring, and honestly thought nothing of it, choosing to capitalize on the events and teach students about puns at the same time, commenting that we had a poltergeist among us who loved poetry and generally freaking us out. It wasn't disrespectful or ironic, it was more of a nod to whatever was happening and generally added to the climate of the room and the culture of the different classes. After winter break, something else happened. I was working with a small group in the back of the class during a test. I was playing music softly in the background. The music went all the way up, as in the volume was maxed, went back to medium level and then went back to max, then slowly went back down to the original volume. Again, I attributed this to our poltergeist. Students thought it was great, and logically, I thought this was due to some issue with a software bug, old wiring or something of that nature. Things like this, lights, volume modulating, happened once a week or so after the initial volume incident, and continued until my last year at the school, when I packed up my classroom and moved to a new school at the end of last year. I finally said goodbye to my little visitor part for nostalgia's sake, and nothing weird happened. I just took my last load of stuff down to my car, pretty anticlimactic. Nothing else happened until a few weeks ago at my new school. At this point it had been about 9 months since anything had happened, and one of my classes had earned a game for the day for an upcoming Friday. One of the students jokingly said that they were going to bring in a Ouija board, to which I said it was not a good idea, and I told him that I'm totally haunted. Of course, they wanted to hear this story, and being that it was the end of the 6 weeks, everyone was passing, and they liked stories. I told them the story and relayed the above. The only thing was this. I told them the story about the volume, and I was leaning over my chair, elbows to my knees, reminiscing as I mentioned the poltergeist. About 10 students were paying attention with eye contact at this point, and I was playing music on my computer when suddenly the volume spiked. It was completely maxed. It then moved to about medium level, maxed again, and went back to a quiet background ambience. And that's where the girls and a boy screamed. It freaked them out. They lost it. One Catholic student hung his crucifix on the volume knob and said he'd pray for me. One girl ran out the room and refused to come back inside for the rest of the class period. I was able to calm them down, and nothing else happened at school. I asked our tech guru on campus what might have caused the volume to modulate. Wires crossed, rats, hardware or software issues. I don't know this man well. We haven't had conversations, and he replies saying that it isn't possible. There's no logical reason, and then he said that you must be haunted. This was in front of a class where I have a few students from the original class that saw the volume thing happen earlier. It freaked them out, and I laughed it off, but it was the first time I really considered the words in relation to poltergeist. I looked around my classroom, and the one thing I bought decoration-wise from my middle school classroom was a painting/drawing of Edgar Allan Poe that I've hung on my bulletin board in the back. This last Monday was my first time when something happened at home. 2 things, actually. I went to my younger son's room to wake him up, flipped on his desk lamp, and the bulb burnt out with a loud pop. I don't think much of it until I was drying my hair in the downstairs bathroom. My younger son was downstairs reading his book on the couch, way out of range from the bathroom. I had a hairdryer blasting near my head, so it was pretty loud, and my husband, dog, and older son were upstairs when I hear a loud scratching at head height on the bathroom door. It was seriously loud, as if my dog, a German Shepherd, was scratching up that high. So I immediately turned off the hairdryer, opened the door saying, "What is it?" And my youngest son ran around the corner saying, "What was that, Mum?" Completely clueless. I didn't have the courage to tell my husband until after school break. He's quite logical generally, and honestly I was embarrassed he'd think I was crazy. He tried to explain that I must be tired and stressed. All logical, good-natured suggestions. He's telling me this as he was walking towards the bathroom to prove a point. That's when he found the scratches on the bathroom door around head height. Not gouged into the wood, but scratches in the varnish you can clearly see at an angle. I asked him what to do, and he said to share it with you, and get suggestions as to what you guys think.
When I was 12, I was sitting outside under a tree. The Arizona heat must have put me to sleep, because during this sleep I had the most vivid dream. I knew it was only a dream. It had to be, because I remembered waking up utterly petrified. It wouldn't be until 4 years later that this dream I had would become a reality. Throughout those 4 years, my grandma, who I loved dearly and who had raised me, would be in and out of the hospital due to her diabetes and dialysis. Each time, it was the same hospital. God knows I hated that hospital. I would always know when we were there as soon as I could see that big oversized hammer and that ugly mouse sculpture that we were there. On this day though, I was already in her hospital room and sitting in a chair next to her. Then all of a sudden, across from my grandma's bed, I saw this young girl. She was laying in a bed staring right at me. Only her face looked disfigured, and she was laughing wickedly. I kept staring at her, hearing this scary-ass laugh. Then I see her mum is there too, standing right beside her. And now she's laughing at me too, both of them laughing hysterically. I get up from my chair and start screaming, "She's a witch!" and pointing. My finger at them both, I keep on yelling. Grandma doesn't move. It's like she couldn't hear, or maybe she was asleep, I don't know. I'm so scared alone and don't know what's happening. My mum comes running in after hearing me screaming. She tries to grab me. She tries to put me in a bear hug and whispers for me to be quiet, but I'm freaking out. Then the room starts spinning and I'm hyperventilating. At that moment a nurse walks in. She sees the hysterics I'm in, and her and my mum bring in a wheelchair. They put me in the wheelchair, and as I'm being rolled away, I'm still looking at the mum and daughter, and shaking from fear. I couldn't even tell you if they were laughing or crying at this point, and just remembering it makes my heart beat like crazy. Now, my mum's pushing me on the wheelchair inside the elevator, when I hear a ding and the doors open. I get this quick sense that I've been here before, trying to focus and being pushed down a long hallway, then into a little room, and I suddenly start to remember my dream. I'm laying on top of the bed, barely breathing, in a brown paper bag. My mum's sitting in the chair beside me crying, and that's when the same nurse is at the foot of my bed scornfully saying, "If she doesn't pace her breathing, she's going to die." She then turns around, walks out the door, slamming it right behind her, and I quickly snap out of whatever was a hold of me. When I look towards my mum, I grab her hand and say, "Don't worry, Mama, I'm gonna be okay." I take a deep breath and try to relax and start to breathe normally. Now this could have been where it ended, only in my dream. 4 years later though, it did end here, and I died. And that crazy nurse wasn't there either. She was only in my dream. My grandma, who was a Catholic, prayed and believed in saints, and had lots of colourful rosaries that were placed in her Santo statues. I would often wear these rosaries with a cute tank top and dicky slacks, especially when I would go out, and I was 18 when Grandma died. When I dream about her, they feel so real, and I wake up crying because I truly can't tell if she's passed or if I'm going to see her later. But I know she's watching over me. I was in line at the grocery store. I had mine and hers favourite pink rosary on, when I notice an older woman looking at me. She's dressed in black, has dark wavy hair, and she's wearing dark sunglasses. So I stare back, but from the corner of my eye, when suddenly the rosaries I was wearing burst on the ground into a million pieces. I mean, every bead was on the ground. The lady and I made eye contact, and in a hurry she walked away. As I was trying to pick up the beads, I saw her walk, then disappear into the crowd. Embarrassed, I quickly scooped up what I could find and tried to look up for this lady. Why? Because this lady looked exactly like the girl's mum who was in the hospital where my grandma died, and who I could call the witch in my dream.
I ended up finding a secret passage. The landing on the staircase going upstairs was hinged. If you opened it up, you could drop into the area below the staircase. From there you could open the door in the wall, which leads down to the basement. In theory, you could act as if you were going upstairs from the main floor, and go through the above to get into the basement and escape the house from the basement door. This house is in upstate New York and dated back at least to 1895. Possibly we thought it was some underground railroad stuff, or maybe prohibition related. We did find old bottles of liquor in the walls when we remodeled, and I imagine it was an easy way for people to transport moonshine or the like. When I was in grade 9, it was just a normal boring day at Brooks High School. We were doing work when we got an announcement saying code black, which means lockdown. My teachers quickly locked the doors, shut the curtains on the windows, and I heard some of the other teachers rush out and lock the 2 doors in our foyer. And I said to myself, awesome, no work. I was always like that whenever the fire alarm went off, but I knew it could be serious, and I had to be sensible and listen to my teachers in case something bad happened. Everyone sat at their desks while I sat on a bench seat, which was close to the door, and even though the window on the classroom door was covered, I tried to look out the side to see if I could see anyone on the school grounds through the foyer window, but nothing. The whole school was that quiet. It was the quietest I've ever heard our grade block. It started to become scary and freaky. After a while, we finally got the all-clear announcement and went about our day. At lunch, rumours were going around saying that some idiot in our grade who I hated held the assistant principal up at knife point, and he had a list of people he wanted to kill including one of my friends, and he was the one who told me the rumor. I think he was expelled, and ever since then we never had another lockdown, not even after we graduated, and from this day I know my old high school is safe and secure for anyone to attend. I once found a room in the back of my parents' closet when I was a kid. It was essentially a kid-sized hole cut into the drywall that led to a small room under the stairs leading to the basement. None of us knew it was there. The room was all concrete with some 2x4s stretching across the ceiling and others acting as supporting beams from the stairs. It was totally empty, but it was covered in graffiti from the previous owners, and that is how I learnt about curse words. I saw a shadow person once. I didn't know that's what it was until much later. I was living in a house in Laguna Beach that had been there since the 1920s. In its history, it had been a speakeasy, a brothel, and a house for smuggling illegal immigrants. One day, my new wife and I were having an argument. I can't even recall what it was about. She walked down the block to get a cup of coffee and cool off, and I was home alone in the house. The way the place was built was incredibly haphazard. There was a bedroom and living room on one side, then a bathroom with 2 entrances on the other side. On the other side of the bathroom was a hallway that had windows in one side and 2 bedrooms on the other. From my bedroom, I could look across the hall into the bathroom, then through the bathroom and down the other hall. I was standing at my dresser, and I just noticed movement from the corner of my eye. I looked down, and there was, honest to God, a black figure. It gives me chills just remembering this. It was about 3 feet tall and vaguely humanoid. It looked like a black scribble, like someone had scribbled a human shape, but the scribbles moved, like electricity arcing. That's the best way to describe it. There was no sound that I could remember. I distinctly remember when I saw it, I wasn't afraid, I was just like, what? Then it noticed me looking at it. I can't say it turned around, it just focused on me, and then I was scared. I didn't move, I didn't scream, nothing. I was just frozen, because it just came at me, rushing down the hallway towards me. I have no idea what it intended, but as soon as it entered the bathroom, the door closest to me just slammed shut on its own. Then I screamed. I yelled for my wife. She wasn't home, and I went the hell out into the daylight and didn't go back until she got home about 10 minutes later. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe I saw something supernatural. But I do know I saw something. I just don't know what it is. When I was in 6th grade, I went to some apartment complexes with 2 friends and it was crazy. The whole thing was pretty much a normal apartment complex, and then the place we went was a friend of a friend's mum's apartment. I think he owned it or something. It was super big, probably like 5+ apartments worth. I remember the layout was strange. You entered and you got into the kitchen straight ahead, and to the right was a hallway. The kitchen had like a teacup for the dining area. Down the hallway, I don't really remember what was inside there, probably his room or something. At the end though, there were stairs leading to the bottom floor. In there you opened an airplane door and were literally inside of a plane. There was a projector inside and we got to watch a movie in there. Next, there was another door in the plane that led to some big area. It was like a big upstairs with an upper floor with a railing, and in that floor there was a big cutout to the floor below. On the bottom floor there was a room with a surgery table and was set up to be a scene from the Twilight Zone. There you would go upstairs and there was some kind of kitchen with a hidden room in the closet. The hidden room led to a giant stage with no bottom seats, only upper seating. Then stairs to get down. Then the seats led to some other things, where it was another little hidden doorway, and it was on some railing thing. This must sound super confusing, but the house was sick and so strange.
One particular plain evening, I was visiting my grandparents with my family. My grandparents lived in what I could accurately describe as being the middle of nowhere, a little cattle ranch near Moses Lake, Washington, their nearest neighbor, roughly 3 miles away. I was a young boy at the time, interested in video games and fantastic adventures, and as I was laying, drifting off to sleep next to my brother, my thoughts fantasized about being akin to a certain hero of a game I had been enjoying. At some point I was somewhere between awake and asleep, a state I think others might call lucid dreaming. I remember the dream clearly. I was in a dark forest hunting monsters, beasts like werewolves, and as I stood over the corpse of a freshly toppled foe, I looked up at a full moon, and a loud bell rang out, and a voice intoned, "Lucifer." I don't know why, but this brought me panic. I tried to quiet the noise but failed, and the bell and voice rang out again. And suddenly I was awake. I was on the floor of my grandparents' living room, laying next to me my brother, who was sleeping deeply. We were not alone. There was a presence behind me. I could not turn to face it. It radiated terror that I have never felt. I could feel its tension on me. It knew I was awake, and it observed me. It felt as if there was a pressure like a wind from a large 3-bladed fan turning. I hadn't the strength to poke my brother and hope he would rouse. I curled into a ball and prayed, though I'm not particularly religious, and the more I prayed and begged for deliverance, the more it tried to invade me. After what could have been hours or minutes, it left in a flash, pausing in my grandparents' room on its departure. I was awake and full of adrenaline, and did not manage to fall back asleep. In the morning, the rest of my family seemed to have all had an uneventful night. The full moon from my dreams seemed to overlap with the street lamp.
Once at the boarding school I went to, I often tried to find out what were behind doors. Once I found access to a room directly under the glass roof. Me and my friends started to hang out there quite regularly, and I guess the school wanted it to be used, but hadn't yet planned for it. The door was open most of the time, but a lot of teachers didn't know about it. Also, I found an attic full of stuff like furniture and so on, but mostly dust. It seemed adventurous in the beginning, but soon turned out kind of boring. When everyone knows your secret hideout, it stops being so secret.
I used to run a Cub Scout pack years ago, and one weekend we were camping at a Scout Association-run camp. It was about 2 a.m. on the Saturday morning, and I was woken up by one of the boys screaming. It was a really loud, really terrified scream. I crashed out of my tent, and as I ran to where the boys were, a row of domed tents with 4 boys in each, when the screaming stopped. I was looking for a tiger or something dragging a Cub Scout out and devouring him. Not that we get tigers in southeast London, but the screaming had been that terrible. But there was just silence. No other kids had awoken, but I'd been joined by the other 2 leaders, equally worried and mystified. I couldn't believe that the other boys hadn't woken up, or that there wasn't anyone crying, but just silence. We still had the same number of boys in the morning. It didn't happen again, and we never did find out where that voice was coming from.
The first incident happened when I was 11 years old, in 1989. We had just moved to a very hot state from a very cold one, and it was a few weeks into the school year. My stepfather at the time was a cheap ass, so he wouldn't turn on our air conditioning, so we had our windows open at night. It being roughly 85 Fahrenheit at night, so it was very hot. I could see my windows from where my bed was. It had vertical blinds over it, which were closed, but the window was open. I woke up at some point in the night, seeing light shining through the blinds and hearing a radio or some kind of chatter. I couldn't understand the words being spoken, but it sounded like people talking. I thought the neighbors were throwing a party, which is weird for a weekday around 3 a.m. So I tried to ignore it and go back to bed. Maybe an hour later, it's dark again in my room. I woke up and looked to my side and saw what everyone describes as a typical grey alien, about 3-ish feet tall with big black eyes. It was terrifying. It turned to face me as I noticed it. It looked like stop motion, how it was all slow and jerky. As it faced me, I threw my blanket over my head, tucked in all of my limbs under it and crossed my legs so that none of me was exposed and began praying. I've never been a religious person, but I didn't know what to do. I asked to every deity I was aware of, Jesus, Allah, Buddha, anything I could do to please protect me and make it go away. I remember how terrified I was, my heart pounding in my chest. It was so hot under those blankets that I could barely breathe, but I was too scared to move for what felt like hours. I didn't exactly know what time it was or how long I lay there, but I stayed there, too scared to move, praying until the sun came up and my alarm for school went off. Since that day, I've slept with my head under the covers every night until I was an adult, and even now I sometimes do. Soon after that, I was diagnosed with an incurable, yet manageable autoimmune disease. Not that they were related incidents, but I feel like it's relevant to mention. In my search for answers, I saw a psychic once, who was positive I was full of crap. She said that their appearance was related to my illness, but I'm fairly sure she didn't know what she was talking about. A few years ago I got hypnotized and EMDR done, related to these memories. Out of the hypnosis I remembered that there were 3 of them, 1 in my room and 2 outside my window. The hypnosis also brought up a memory of a different night in the same house, where I was getting a drink in the kitchen late at night. The idea was conveyed that they were hiding under the kitchen table, and they were or are always around, watching. I don't like saying the word alien because I'm not sure what they are. They also didn't look exactly the same way they're depicted. They don't look organic or fleshy. They look very angular and sharp. 99% of the pictures that you see online are fake. At least they don't look like what I've seen. I saw one picture taken in the dark next to a car where you can see one off in the distance illuminated by flash. But that's the only time I've ever seen media of it potentially looking like what I saw. The therapist that did the hypnosis thought I had some kind of abuse, and that's where the PTSD came from. But no matter how hard she poked at the idea, it never panned out. I don't think that ever happened to me, as in it doesn't explain the other memories that happened way later when we moved out of that house, and away from my stepfather, the only one who had any potential to try and hurt any of us. The hypnosis revealed a much earlier memory when I was around 7 and living in the aforementioned cold state. I remember standing in the snow in the middle of the night. It wasn't cold, but I was barefoot, and I saw a woman in a red dress. She was one of them, big head, scary eyes, and was taller than the rest, and I felt safe with her, like a friendly mom or family vibe. There were other people out in that snow too. Some were walking somewhere, I don't know if they were going very far, and there were ships in the distance. There's a specific feeling I get even now which reminds me of exactly that feeling of standing in the snow, where my body is warm but the air all around is cold and dark, like familiar and comfortable but lonely and isolating, like warm and cold at the same time. The second time I saw them, I was still living in a very warm southern state in a different house with a different stepdad. This one was actually amazing. I found myself waking up sitting on the floor in our kitchen across from Helen Hunt, the actor, at the time. Mad About You was pretty popular and I had a bit of a crush on her, you see. I was confused because I woke up sitting cross-legged and also Helen Hunt was smiling, sitting a foot away. "You don't really look like this, do you?" she said. "No, but I thought you would be more pleasant than you." I noticed around the corner in the other room, hiding behind a chair, there was one of the aliens. I felt that I was angry, so I asked her what her deal was, and she told me not to worry about them, that they were just jealous of people. I didn't understand what that was supposed to mean other than be dismissive. The fake Helen Hunt made me feel safe. I figured she went out of her way to look for this, and to make it more pleasant for me, so that others may show concerns for my feelings. Maybe they can't all be bad. I felt like she was protecting me from the scarier ones, but they were also present. But she seemed like she was in control. My paranoia said that they just wanted me to be convinced. And I talked with her some more, but I didn't remember any of it, other than it being a generally pleasant experience, besides how strange it was. There were other small pieces I remember, odd situations that happened around the same time. My sister waking up late one night scared because she saw a light move outside her window. I watched as there were power lines and you could see stars moving back and forth over them, using the wires as reference. I couldn't have seen the satellite, or stars or planes. They were literally dancing around. My sister and I were too scared to sleep, so I told her I'd sleep on the floor to keep her company. I asked her as an adult if she had any memories about them, but she told me she did not. Not even the light incident? There was this odd dream I had been given a task in, which was to catch a fish. Then the dream would repeat itself and give me a slightly different circumstance. I'd catch a fish, but only with a spear this time. It would repeat several times until I would become aware of it. That would break the dream logic and I would wake up. And it happened several times. I would always wake up with the same feeling of dread that happened after, and it always felt like I was related to them. I've had dreams where I was being chased by them, where ships were searching for me with beams while I was in the building, and it's been a pretty consistent theme throughout my life. I've mentioned this in the last one before, but when I was 17 to 18 I was still living at home in the same house from before. At this point it was now the mid-90s. I wake up in bed and saw a bunch of Muppets or puppets throwing a party in my bedroom. They were mostly fuzzy and blue, I think. The light in my room was bright and happy, and I felt like this Muppet show was condensing, and told them I don't believe them and that this is fake. As soon as I said that it was fake, it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. The lighting went from happy to dark and dramatic immediately. All of the fuzzy blue Muppets peeled off their masks, revealing big, scary grey aliens. I couldn't tell you how many there were, but I felt like there was a lot of them. A big one floated out of the closet towards me. It didn't walk, it just glided, and I could tell that it was pissed. He talked, or at least I heard him, because I don't remember seeing their mouths. We're trying to make this easier for you, but that's not going to happen now. I was terrified, just crying in bed and sobbing. The big one cradled my head and looked at me, seeing me so scared and upset, then said, "You're not ready yet." Then I woke up in bed in the morning with dry tears on my face. After that night, I haven't seen them again. I feel like I failed a test after the Muppet encounter, since they were testing my fear level or something, I don't know. But I've seen the occasional shadow person run across my house. I've had a dream about them. I've had 1 or 2 incidents where I felt like something was in my house and went around searching closets like a madman at 3 a.m. I'm not saying it was aliens. I've become comfortable with the idea that maybe I hallucinated these things, or maybe there were experimental drugs in school cafeteria lunches. Perhaps it's just vaccine side effects. Who knows? All that I know is that I saw it, and that it was real. I grew up in a small town in Maryland, right on the borders of Pennsylvania and Delaware. We moved into our neighborhood in 1974, and I was an infant. The builders had 3 styles you could choose from: and one being a pretty unique design. I always wished my parents would have picked that one. There is only one other neighborhood I know that must have been built by the same people. Across the border in Delaware, I've lived all over, and I've also had jobs as a cable installer, so I'm pretty familiar with most neighborhoods in the area and design and layout. Back in the early 60s, there was a plane crash that would have been a 10-minute walk from my house. Over 80 people passed during the incident. Pan Am Flight 214. Ghost stories and sightings were all part of my childhood, but not really related to what happened to me. My family moved to Virginia in 1991, and with the exception of one childhood friend, I had no ties with the area after that. I joined the military, and then I took a job out in Utah. After some strange life happenings, I had the opportunity to move my wife and young son back to this same small town. It was a great place to grow up. Well, it was back in the 80s, but there are so many problems there now. We didn't move to the same neighborhood, but rented an apartment not too far away, a couple of miles at most from my childhood home. My wife worked the midnight shift, and often my son would sleep in our bed when she was at work. He was around 5 at the time. It was somewhere around 11 p.m., and my son was in there fast asleep. I went in, and had just pulled him in close. I just love cuddling him. I really missed those times. I hadn't even turned on the TV yet. I'm one of those weirdos who has to have it on to fall asleep. I had just gotten underneath the covers. And, as a kid, everyone called me Kenny. But everyone since high school called me Ken. Or just as I was about to grab the remote and turn on the TV, I hear my name whispered. Kenny. I laid perfectly still for a few more minutes listening. I didn't even want to breathe. Did my wife come home? Beside her, very few people call me Kenny, and nobody within 1,500 miles. Maybe there are people outside and I could hear them. Did I leave the TV on in the living room? Birds? Upstairs neighbors? I finally relaxed. I mean, what could it be? Then it happened again. Kenny. This time a more forceful whisper, possibly agitated, possibly trying to get my attention but not wanting to wake up my son. The worst part? As it said my name, the hairs on the back of my head parted with its breath. Both my parents passed away in '97 in unrelated events. They never met their grandchildren, and I often wonder if my mother came to visit. I can't be 100% sure, but it sounded feminine, although very raspy. I've never been so afraid. I just knew if I rolled over, somebody would have been there. I must have laid there for hours before drifting off finally. I didn't tell a soul about this, not my wife, not my best friend, nobody. About 2 weeks go by and I had trained this guy at work. He became a pretty good friend at the time, and we learned we had extremely similar backstories. He grew up in the same house style I did in Delaware, and we also went to the same very small private school. People who grew up in the area don't even know it's there. There were only 13 other kids in my 8th grade class. Same car growing up, parents had similar backstories. It was a bit uncanny but nothing too crazy. Well, one night, we were hanging out and he said something to the effect of, "Please don't make fun of me, but I have something to tell you," and proceeded to tell me an almost identical tale of what happened to him. I'd never told anyone, and we have no idea if they are related, but he said he was laying in bed at 1 a.m. and someone whispered his name twice. He got up, looked around, had a smoke, and decided to just stay up for the rest of the night. Not sure what that means, or if the two events were related, but it really freaked us out. I am a 25-year-old Latino male. I live in a large city, and am married, and have 2 kids. But that's besides the point. It has nothing to do with them. Onto the story. It's really bizarre. I work at a 10-floor building as an armed guard for solely the interior part of the building. I only stay inside because we have other guards at the main entrance that check people in. So I only monitor cameras and conduct patrols whenever I want to by the hour. It's really boring most of the time, which brings me to Reddit, lurking. Anyway, some of the floors in the building are occasionally blocked off for renovations. The floor is either completely demolished, or if it's being completely empty, means that it's my favorite places to go while I'm patrolling. Because no one's allowed to be on those floors except security, contractors, renovations, or the janitors. I leave to do my usual patrols, but before I decide that I need to go to the bathroom. But when I do, the men's room is completely full. So I have my most bright idea. Hey, that floor with the renovations will be completely empty. And because no one gets to go there, it'll be spotless. I think I'll hurry to complete my patrol and get to the restroom. Except it's not empty. I don't find it to be extremely odd, as it's about 10 AM and the elevators still go to this floor. I just think somebody has the same idea I had. So I go to the stall furthest away from this guy and try to do my business. Without trying to gross everyone out, I'm gonna tell you this story like it happened. I dropped my pants and I'm handling business. And as soon as I do, this guy is whispering shit all creepy like. Not completely weird at first, but then it just gets louder and louder. And I hear words like, him, over there, they, and you. I think the dude is trying to get my attention, so I'm sitting here, eyes wide open, glad that I'm already on the job. Still, this guy's whispering stuff like he's possessed. I can't even comfortably use the restroom because this guy's freaking me out. So then I realized something, that from the moment I got in here, until the point, which is about 10 minutes give or take a couple, I don't think I once heard anything giving the impression that this dude is even using the bathroom. So everything told me in my instincts not to look, but I do anyway, towards his feet. And this guy is not even on the bathroom. He's standing straight up whispering. So I completely irrationally noped out of there so that I could radio my entrance guard to inform him of what was going on. I posted myself in the hallway waiting for this guy to come out. 30 minutes passed, and I'd had enough of this. I walked in twice, acting if I was going to wash my hands, and the third time, I'd had enough. So I knock on his stall and say, "Security, is everything all good in there?" A completely normal voice responds, "Yeah, I'm fine." I wait about 2 to 3 more minutes, and this dude finally comes out. He asks if someone reported him. I told him no, and that I was using the restroom and he was exhibiting strange behavior, and that he was there for a really long time. He says it was nothing, and I ask for his work badge and get his name and company, and explain that he's not allowed to be on this floor. He says he understands, and that it won't happen again, with a look in his face like I scared him. I really hope not to see him again. Norwich is an old medieval city in England and has lots of beautiful and interesting old places to visit. One of its most famous buildings is the towering Norwich Cathedral, opposite Tomland, which sits down by the river Wensum. Anyhow, busy exploring my new city one Saturday, I visited the cathedral, and after wandering the building, decided to explore the cathedral close. It was late, a sunny afternoon in October, with lots of autumn leaves on the ground, and I was really enjoying my walk when I stumbled upon a cobbled alley at the end of some houses, and decided to see where it led. The floor and walls were cobbled, and the walls maybe 10 foot high, so I couldn't see over them, but I could hear people in the gardens on the other side talking and children playing. Although I was on my own in the alleyway, I didn't feel alone. But as I began to walk on, the alley began to twist and turn, and although the sky was blue overhead and the sun was still out, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. I could no longer hear voices coming from the other side of the walls, and when I thought about it, realized that in fact I couldn't hear anything. No birds, no traffic, not even wind, and yet the cathedral is in the middle of a reasonably sized city. I began to feel nervous, and my scalp started to prick, and so I began to up my pace, telling myself that I'd been walking a while, and that the alleyway couldn't go on forever. But as I turned each blind bend, hoping to see the end of what was beginning to feel like a maze, I was only met with another stretch of alleyway. I began to jog, and although I hadn't seen anyone since entering the alleyway, and couldn't hear any footsteps on the cobbles behind me, I had the growing sensation that someone or something bad was following me close behind, and that the walls were pressing on. I started having difficulty breathing and realized I was also beginning to feel dizzy. I didn't want to pass out alone in this alleyway, and so decided to run. After what seemed like forever, I turned another corner and suddenly sprinted out onto a perfectly normal-looking street down by the river, and the city sounds returned. I realized I was shaking, my hand and forehead dripping with sweat, and didn't have a clue where I was. I sat down on a wall and had a cigarette, and pulled myself together, and then stopped a passerby and asked for directions back to the market square in the middle of town, from where I could find my own way back to campus. It didn't take long to walk back to the market square, but when I checked my watch, it turned out that I had been in the alleyway for nearly an hour. It didn't make any sense, as I couldn't have walked that far, but I didn't want to know too much about it, and told myself that maybe it was all the twists and turns the alley had, and that added to the time. At class on Monday, I was telling a few people about the alleyway in the cathedral grounds, and how it had suddenly turned really spooky, when one of the mature students on our course, who had lived in Norwich for years and knew a lot about its history, overheard me. She asked me if the alley was an old cobbled one with high walls that led off the cathedral close, and I said yes. She took me aside and quietly explained to me that she wasn't surprised I'd felt what I did, because that was the alleyway they dragged people accused of witchcraft along before burning them at the stake, as Norwich has a huge history of witches. But the kicker to this story is that though I lived in Norwich for a number of years and often visited the cathedral, I never walked that alleyway again because of what happened, until that afternoon one day, when a friend from overseas was visiting. I took her down to the cathedral, and while there told her about the alleyway and what I'd experienced. She insisted that we walk it, and when I stalled and started to make excuses, promised me that if things started to go bad, we would just turn back, and she would stay with me at all times. Reluctantly, I agreed. The alley was just how I remembered it at first. Dry cobbled floor and high cobbled walls backing onto people's gardens. But after 10 minutes at most, and only a handful of turns, suddenly we found ourselves back onto the street. It didn't make any sense to me back then, and it still doesn't to this day, and I don't go near the Witch's Walk anymore.